The key went in on the fourth try. Not the first, not the second or the third. The fourth, when her fingers had gone so numb she could barely feel the metal, when the wind off the mountain had settled into her spine like it planned to stay. Something shifted deep inside the lock. Release. The door moved. Behind it, darkness. Cold air older than anything she'd touched in years, and a smell she couldn't name. Like a room that had been holding its breath. She had 750 left in the world. She had nowhere else to go. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that behind that door, someone had been waiting for her. Not a person. Something more patient than a person. 31 years of waiting. She stepped inside. The key went in on the fourth try. Not the first, not the second or the third. The fourth, when her fingers had gone so numb she could barely feel the metal anymore. When the wind off the mountain had worked its way through every gap in her Carhartt jacket and settled somewhere around her spine like it planned to stay, the key went in. Something shifted deep inside the lock. A sound like grinding teeth and then release. The door moved. Just an inch. Just enough to let the cold air out from inside, which seemed wrong because it was already freezing out here. But the air coming from behind that door was different. Older. Like a room that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Claire Whitmore stood in the snow with one hand on a steel door the size of a barn wall and tried to remember why she had thought this was a good idea. She couldn't. Exactly. Remember. The 750 bid felt logical at 2 in the morning with her phone at 3% battery and the temperature dropping and no plan left. It felt considerably less logical now. But the door was open. So she went in. 9 weeks earlier, Claire had been someone who owned things. Not a lot of things. She had never been the kind of woman who collected things, or decorated carefully, or worried much about whether her throw pillows matched. She had a good truck that started every morning. A set of snap-on tools her father had bought piece by piece over 15 years, and passed down to her like other men, passed down watches or cuff links. A 2-bedroom apartment on Decatur Street where the radiator knocked every night but the water pressure was excellent. She had a job. 9 years at Davidson Automotive. 3rd-generation shop, good reputation. The kind of place where people brought their cars and came back because someone had actually fixed the problem instead of just resetting the light. She was the best mechanic on the floor. Not the most senior. Not the most liked by the other guys, who had opinions about a woman who diagnosed engine problems by sound alone. But the best. She knew it. Her boss, Frank Davidson, knew it. The customers who asked specifically for her knew it. Which is maybe why, when Frank sold the shop to a man named Greg Harlan in November, things went the way they went. Greg Harlan was 38 years old and had purchased Davidson Automotive as one of 4 investment properties he acquired that month. He drove a white Range Rover and wore boat shoes in November and stood in the middle of the shop floor on his first at base back and talked about his crew, his guys, the team he was bringing in. Claire had been under a Silverado at the time. She slid out from under it and stood up and wiped her hands and looked at him. He looked at her the way some men look at women in certain rooms. Not rudely, just evaluating, adjusting. She went back to the Silverado. 2 weeks later, she got a Tuesday afternoon envelope. Restructuring. The word they use when they don't want to say the real word. 2 weeks severance. A handshake that felt like a door closing in her face. She drove out of the parking lot and got to the end of the block and stopped at a red light and sat there through 3 cycles of green without moving. The person behind her eventually honked. She drove home. Spent the rest of the afternoon sitting at her kitchen table not calling anyone. Not her mother, who would say she'd told her so without specifying what exactly she'd told her. Not her friend Joe, who would immediately come over and bring wine and have good intentions and exhaust Claire within 20 minutes. Not anyone. She sat there and looked at the table and thought about the Silverado. It had a transmission issue that Harlan's new crew was going to miss for at least 2 visits before they figured it out. She had been about to fix it. She had known exactly what was wrong with it. Nobody asked her. December came fast. The savings lasted 6 weeks. Not because she was careless, she had always been careful. The kind of careful that comes from watching your father be careful. From understanding that things can disappear, but because rent in Denver had gotten to a place where careful didn't stretch the way it used to. She applied everywhere. Every shop, every dealership, every oil change place that had a sign in the window or a form on their website. Most of them didn't call back. A few brought her in and then brought in someone else. Winter is slow, they said. Not a good time. We'll keep your application on file. The application on file. That great American tradition of filing things where they can be politely forgotten. The eviction notice appeared under her door on a Tuesday. Thin paper. Official letterhead. 14 days. She sat on the floor with it in her hand for a while. The tools went first. The snap-on set. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that she would have to sell them. Had known it and pushed the thought away every day for 2 weeks until the math finally stopped lying to her. She drove to the pawn shop on Morrison Road, that she had driven past 100 times without thinking much about. Walked in, put the tools on the counter. The man offered her $400 for the set. She didn't negotiate. She just took the money and left and sat in her truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Her father had worked double shifts for 3 months to buy the first wrench. She remembered being 12 years old and watching him open the box. The way he held it, like it meant something. It had. It did. She drove away. The moving process took one afternoon because she didn't have much left. 2 boxes. A duffel bag. Her work clothes. Because she was not ready to stop believing she would need them. She loaded everything into the truck and drove to a Walmart parking lot on the eastern edge of the city and backed into a spot between a camper van and a pickup that looked like it had been living there for a while. And that was that. Home. She had told herself she was being practical, temporary. A person making rational decisions under pressure. She had told herself a lot of things. What she was scared. A type of scared that didn't announce itself loudly, didn't come with shaking hands or racing thoughts. Not at first. It came as a kind of flatness, a going through motions quality to every hour. She ate because eating made sense. She drove to the truck stop on I-70 every morning to wash up in the bathroom because that was the logical thing to do. She kept a list in her phone of the parking lots she had used and the ones that had asked her to move, and she rotated them on a schedule because organization was something she could control. She was at heart a person who fixed things. Problems were diagnosable. Problems had sources. You found the source, you addressed it, you moved on. This problem was not behaving like a problem she knew how to fix. 6 weeks in, she had 800. The weather had dropped into the low teens. The truck's heater worked fine, which was something. The snap-on tools were gone, which was not. She checked job listings on her phone every night until her data ran low, and then she stopped and stared at the ceiling of the cab, which was not technically a ceiling. Just the fabric interior above the back seat, slightly sagging in one corner, and listened to the parking lot settle into its nighttime sounds. Engines. The occasional cart collecting creak. Wind. She had a plan in the loosest possible sense of the word. A friend of a friend in Colorado Springs who sometimes had shop work. A lead on an apartment she couldn't quite afford that might be negotiable. 2 more applications she hadn't heard back on. None of it was a plan. All of it was hoping. The auction listing appeared at 2:17 in the morning on a Wednesday in mid-December, which was the kind of time when a person's judgment is at its absolute least reliable, which Claire understood and chose to ignore. She had been scrolling rental listings. Not productively, she was 8 days away from having enough for a deposit on anything, and everything in her price range had either been taken or turned out to be someone's unheated basement with a handshake lease, but scrolling because stopping meant sitting in silence, and silence had gotten very loud lately. The website glitched, redirected her to a page she hadn't been looking for. Government surplus auction. Foreclosed properties. Mostly the kind of thing that sounds like an opportunity until you read the fine print: condemned buildings, landlocked lots, the occasional structure that had been red tagged by the county, for reasons the listing didn't fully explain. She was about to close the tab. Then she saw it. Underground storage facility. Teller County, Colorado. Former Cold War era structure. 40 acres, remote mountain location. As is where is. Starting bid $500. Auction closes in 6 hours. 1 photograph. A concrete face set into a hillside. A heavy steel door. Nothing else. She read it 3 times. Her rational mind had several clear things to say about this. She did not know anything about the property. She had never seen it. The phrase "as is, where is," in a real estate context was widely understood to mean there is something seriously wrong with this thing and we are telling you ahead of time so you cannot complain later. It was 40 acres in a mountain location with an access road described as unpaved, which in her experience covered everything from a nice gravel drive to 2 ruts through a field. It could be flooded, collapsed, contaminated, empty in the way that made the word shelter meaningless. It could also be shelter. She watched the countdown for a long time without touching her phone. Then she bid 500. Waited. Bid again at 650 when something in her decided that $650 was meaningfully different from 500, which it wasn't, really. But she was not operating on full reason at 3 a.m. At 17 minutes before close, she changed the bid to 750. Her whole body registered it. The way you feel when you step off a curb without realizing it. That small drop. That involuntary intake. She hit confirm. At 6:43 in the morning, she owned a bunker in the mountains. The drive took 4 hours. West on I-70, then up through the mountains, then off onto county roads that got narrower and less maintained with every turn. The truck handled it well enough. Claire kept both hands on the wheel and watched the elevation climb and didn't let herself think too carefully about what she was driving toward. The town of Crisfield sat in a long valley between 2 ridgelines. Population somewhere around 900 depending on the season. 1 main road, a diner, a hardware store, a post office, the size of a generous closet, and a grocery store called Pierce's that had been there since, apparently, before living memory. She needed the property management office, which turned out to be a single-wide trailer on the edge of town. She also needed food. She stopped at Pierce's first. The bell above the door was the old mechanical kind that actually rang. The store smelled like floor cleaner and coffee and something baked that morning. A woman behind the counter was stocking a shelf with a methodical patience that suggested she had been stocking this same shelf for a very long time and had found peace with it. She turned when Claire came in. 61 maybe. Silver hair cut short and practical. Eyes that were taking notes without being rude about it. The kind of face that had seen enough weather literal and otherwise to stop being surprised by things. "Morning," the woman said. "Morning." Claire picked up crackers, peanut butter, 2 bottles of water. The math of what was left in her account ran automatically in the back of her mind. Passing through or staying. Staying. She hadn't said it out loud before. It landed differently than she expected. "I bought some property, just outside of town." The woman behind the counter, her name tag said. Donna looked at the items Claire had placed on the counter. Then at Claire, then at the piece of paper Claire had taken out of her jacket pocket, at the address on the piece of paper. Something shifted in Donna's face. Not dramatically, just a slight stilling. The way a person goes quiet when they recognize something they weren't expecting to see. "You bought the Hale property?" "Not a question." "Yeah." Claire looked at her. "You know it." Donna was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that had weight to it. "Walter Hale used to come through here," she said finally. "Once a month, sometimes more. Always alone. Always paid cash. He'd buy coffee and a sandwich and sometimes he'd sit at that table over there." She nodded toward a small table by the window. "For 20 minutes before he drove out. Never talked about himself. Paid for whoever was behind him in line." She paused. "Stopped coming about 5 years ago." "He died," Claire said. "August 2018. "I know." Donna looked at her steadily. "He was a particular kind of man. The kind who prepares for things." "What kind of things?" Donna was quiet again. It wasn't an evasive quiet. Exactly. More like a considered one. "There are things about that property," she said, "that I think you need to find out yourself." Claire waited for more. More didn't come. "Okay," she said. Donna handed back her change. Their hands didn't quite touch. "Welcome to Crisfield. Hope you've got warm clothes." "I've got work clothes," Claire said. "Close enough." Donna's mouth moved in something that might have been a smile. The property management office was a man named Frank Calloway. 50s. A belly that moved when he walked. The hands of someone who had done more than push paper, calloused in the right places, though whatever work had built those calluses seemed to be somewhere in his past now. He handed her a manila envelope across a folding table without ceremony. "Deed." Survey map. 2 keys. He looked at her in the way people look at you when they have a question they've decided not to ask. You know what you're getting into out there? I'll figure it out. Property's been sitting since 2018. Previous owner died. Estate sold it off. He nodded toward the window where her truck was visible. Access roads unpaved. About 19 miles up Forest Service 81. 4-wheel drive recommended. My truck's fine. Bunker itself, I've never been inside. Exterior door was locked when we listed it. Whatever's in there is yours now. He paused. Good or bad? She took the keys. Heavy. Industrial, cold even through the envelope. Big ones for the exterior door, he said. Small ones supposed to be for the interior, but I can't confirm that, like I said. Never got in. He followed her to the door with something that might have been concern if he'd decided to act on it. Listen, it's supposed to snow tonight, if you're planning to stay out there. I'm planning to stay out there. He looked at her face for a moment. Nearest neighbor's probably 12 miles. Cell service is spotty at best. You get stuck. I know how to get unstuck, Claire said. Thank you, Mr. Calloway. The Forest Service road was not a road. 2 ruts through pine trees, the brush grown in close on both sides, branches that scraped along the doors like something trying to get in. The truck bottomed out twice on rocks she didn't see coming. She drove at a crawl. 8 miles an hour. 10 when the surface was flat enough to risk it. 40 minutes. The trees opened into a clearing. She stopped, let the engine idle. In front of her, rising from the hillside, like something the mountain had grown, rather than something people had built into it, was the bunker entrance. 20 feet wide, maybe 12 feet high, concrete that had gone the color of old bone. The steel door at the center was massive, 7 feet tall, 4 feet wide, hinges like forearms. Rust had bled down the face in orange rivers. Ice hung from the edges, where water had worked its way in and frozen, making the entrance look like it had teeth. It was, objectively, the most forbidding thing she had ever considered entering. She sat in the truck for 2 full minutes. Then she got out. The snow in the clearing was deeper than it looked. She broke a path toward the door, boots punching through the crust with each step, the cold working in through the seams of her jacket. The clearing was ringed by dense forest, the sky a flat white, the silence the kind you only get when you're far enough from any road that the ordinary hum of the world can't reach you. She reached the door, looked at the lock. A serious mechanism, not just a deadbolt, but something built into the door itself. The keyhole surrounded by a steel plate. Thick enough to suggest this door had been designed to stay closed if someone wanted it to stay closed. She pulled out the larger key. First try. Nothing. Second try. The key seated differently, but still didn't turn. Third try. She added pressure, tried to feel for the way the tumblers wanted to move, the way her father had taught her, don't force it, let it tell you what it needs. Fourth try. The click came from somewhere deep inside the mechanism. A single clean sound. Then the grinding release of tumblers that hadn't moved in years. She put her weight against the door and pulled. It was heavy, heavier than she'd expected from a door that size, which was saying something, because she'd expected it to be very heavy. Maybe 200 pounds of steel that had been sealed against whatever Walter Hale had decided he needed to seal it against. But the hinges held. The door moved, groaned like a tree in wind, and then swung open. Cold air hit her. Not cold like outside. Cold like a space that had been kept at a specific temperature deliberately. Still. And with it, a smell, concrete and metal and paper, and something else. Something like the inside of a room that has been sealed against the world for a very long time, that has kept its own atmosphere in a bottle for years. She turned on her phone's flashlight. The beam cut into the dark. An entry chamber, concrete walls, concrete floor, concrete ceiling, maybe 20 feet deep. At the far end, a second door, smaller, more ordinary, with a simple handle and a keyhole that matched the smaller key on her ring. In the corners, a few things left behind. A broken chair, 3 legs of 4, a cable spool, a folded tarp over something she couldn't identify. No water on the floor, no obvious structural damage, no smell of mold or rot or the particular wrongness that comes when a building has failed against the elements. The structure was solid. She crossed to the inner door. The small key turned smoothly first try, and the door swung open onto a hallway stretching back into darkness. She moved the flashlight left, right, up. The hallway was lined with conduit and pipes. Doors branched off at intervals. At the far end, a stairwell going down. This wasn't just a room. This was a facility. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment, the cold of the mountain on her back, and the older, stiller cold of the structure in front of her, and did a fast inventory of what she knew. Grid power was somewhere. There were overhead lights in the hallway, fluorescent fixtures still in their housings, and the conduit running along the wall was substantial enough to suggest serious electrical infrastructure. There was plumbing. She could see water lines. There was a ventilation system, or had been. She could see the ductwork running above the light fixtures. None of it was on, but the infrastructure was there. She had spent 9 years diagnosing problems in machines. She had learned over those 9 years to resist the urge to judge a machine by its appearance and instead to locate its logic. How was it designed? What was it supposed to do? Where did its systems connect? This machine, because that was what it was, functionally, a machine for keeping people alive in a controlled environment, had been designed by people who took their work seriously. She could see that in the quality of the welds on the conduit brackets, in the gauge of the pipe, in the fact that the concrete walls showed no significant cracking, despite being in a mountain in a state that froze and thawed every year. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. She found the generator on the second level. The stairwell went down into another hallway, wider than the first, and the first door she opened on the right was the one she'd been looking for, without knowing she was looking for it. The room was maybe 30 by 40 feet, and at the center of it, hulking and massive and faintly oily smelling in the way of diesel machinery everywhere, was a Caterpillar generator that she recognized the class of immediately. 500 kilowatts. The kind of thing you put in a hospital. The kind of thing you build a room around because you're never moving it. She walked around it slowly, checked the fuel gauge first. 3/4 full, which was wrong. In the right direction, but wrong. A diesel generator that had been sitting unused for 5 years should not have 3/4 of a tank. Diesel didn't evaporate, but systems leaked. Things corroded. 3/4 full meant someone had been adding fuel, or the tank hadn't been sitting for 5 years. She checked the oil. Golden. Not black, not sludge. Properly maintained oil. She checked the belts. Aged but not cracked. The air filter. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything. The air filter was clean, not new clean. Not just changed clean, but not years of neglect dirty either. Someone had changed this filter within the last, she thought about it, 6 months. Maybe 8, maybe a year at the outside. Someone had been in here after Walter Hale died. She stood in front of the generator for a moment, factoring this. Then she pressed the start button. The generator coughed twice. The sound of something remembering what it was supposed to do. Then it caught, then it roared to life, with a sound that went through the concrete in the mountain and probably out into the valley below. A sound like something enormous waking up from a sleep it hadn't chosen. The lights in the hallway came on. She could hear, somewhere above her, the ventilation system engaging. And then, after a moment, the deep thrum of the heating system, old ductwork, groaning as it filled with warm air for the first time in years. She stood in the generator room with diesel exhaust drifting past her, and the lights on in the hallway and the heat beginning to move, and thought, okay. The next 4 days were the most productive of her life. That was not hyperbole. She had been productive before she was a person who moved through tasks efficiently, who woke up ready to work, who found the morning's to-do list satisfying in its specificity. But 4 days in that bunker, alone with a structure that had 1,000 things wrong with it, in the sense of being dormant for years, and she moved through them with a focus she hadn't felt since the early weeks at Davidson, when everything was new and every problem was interesting. Water system. An artesian well drilled into the mountain aquifer, with filtration and holding tanks and pumps that activated automatically when she restored power. She ran the tap for 5 minutes before the brown cleared to gray, cleared to clean. She filled a cup and drank it, and it was better than bottled. Electrical. The main panel had every breaker switched off. She brought them up one by one, checking for shorts, listening to the system, the way you listen to a car engine, feeling for wrongness. Nothing blew, everything held. Heating. The system was older than she was, but built to a standard that made modern equipment look careless. Forced air from the generator exhaust heat exchanger, with electric backup elements and distribution through every room. By hour 6, the temperature in the living quarters had come up from the low 40s to 62 degrees. She kept working until it hit 68. She slept that night on a bunk mattress still in its original plastic wrap, still with her jacket on, because 68 degrees in a concrete room is not the same as 68 in a heated apartment, and woke up at 5:30, because she always woke up at 5:30 and lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the hum of the generator and the circulation of warm air through the ducts, and thought, this is a building that is running, a building that works, and it is mine, not because she deserved it, not because she had earned it in any dramatic sense. She had earned it in the very small sense of bidding 750 on some nothing else wanted, and then driving to it in a truck that had started complaining about its transmission on the last mountain grade. But it was hers. The deed said so. On the 4th day, she began to map the facility properly. 3 levels. She had explored parts of the first 2, but the 3rd level she had only glanced at through the stairwell door. It went deeper into the mountain. The air noticeably cooler, the lighting not yet restored, because the breaker for that section had needed a physical relay she'd had to jury-rig from a pot she found in the maintenance closet. On the 4th morning, she got the lights working in the lower level. She went down. The hallway at the base of the 3rd stairwell was different from the levels above. The walls were smoother, the ceiling lower, the doors, where there were doors, were heavier, and the lighting, when it came on, was a cooler color, the kind that made you think of clinical spaces, of rooms where precision mattered. She went door by door. Storage rooms empty, a mechanical space with equipment she didn't recognize, something environmental, sensors and gauges. A room that might have been an office once, a desk still bolted to the floor, and at the end of the hallway, a door unlike any of the others, heavier, steel reinforced in a way that was visible from 10 feet away, the frame integrated into the wall rather than set into it, as if the door and the wall were a single object designed together, and where every other door in the facility had a conventional lock, a keyhole, a handle, this one had a keypad. 6-digit display, backlit, currently showing a dull red glow that suggested it was active and waiting. Above the keypad, stenciled in yellow paint that had faded but not disappeared, authorized access only. Security level required. Asset storage. Claire stood in front of it for a long time. Her 2 keys were on the ring in her pocket. She already knew neither of them would do anything here. This was a different kind of lock, for a different kind of door, and whatever was behind it had not been opened with a keyhole in a very long time. She went back upstairs. The office on the 1st level, the space she'd identified by its layout as administrative, with a desk that had actual drawers and a credenza, and a built-in shelving unit that suggested someone had used this room to keep records she had already spent time in. Found the maintenance logs in a lower drawer, rows of dates and readings, and sign-offs going back to 1996, all in the same careful hand, initialed RG at the bottom of each page. Now she went back to the credenza. The filing cabinet behind it had 3 drawers. She had opened the top 2 and found supply invoices and equipment manuals. The 3rd drawer, the bottom one, was stuck. She had noticed it before and moved on. Now she worked it free. The bottom drawer always swells in humidity, and found a stack of folders at the back behind a series of binders. Documents from 1996. A transfer of ownership from the Department of Defense to something called Winterkey Holdings LLC. Dense legal language. She read through it slowly, the legal prose fighting her at every sentence. But the base structure was there. The facility, having been decommissioned from government use, had passed to a private entity at a nominal purchase price. The buyer had agreed to maintain the structure at their expense. No disclosure requirements beyond local property tax filings. No public record of the contents. She found the maintenance logs again, this time looking at them differently. 22 years of logs. January 1996 through July 2018. Monthly mostly. Sometimes more frequent. Fuel levels. Generator readings. Water quality. HVAC filter changes. battery checks. Every entry in the same careful hand, the same initials, RG, Raymond G. something. A contractor. And then the log for July 2018, the last normal entry. Dated July 14. And then 3 pages later, a single entry out of sequence. Different handwriting. Not the careful, practiced script of the regular logs, but something faster, more compressed. A hand that was writing quickly or writing under pressure. August 22, 2018. Just the date. And below it a single line, systems verified. Generator stable. Left as with one letter, R. Not RG in full. Just R, as if whoever wrote it had started to sign the usual way and then stopped. Walter Hale had died on August 9, 2018. She knew this from her search on the property management website. Died August 9. And this entry was dated August 22, 13 days after his death. Someone had come here after Walter Hale died, had checked the systems, had found the generator stable, had left as instructed, and had signed with only the first letter of their name. She sat with the log in her hands for a while. She was a mechanic. She solved problems by tracing them to their source. This was a problem that had a source. The source was a person named R, who had been here after the owner died, and who had kept this place running when there was no obvious reason to keep it running, except that someone had told them to. She searched the rest of the office. Computer in the corner, Windows XP. She plugged it in and waited, and it actually started, which was more than she'd expected. The hard drive had been wiped, or most of it had. But in the temp folder, because temp folders are where deleted files go to die, slowly she found fragments. A scanned letter, accessed last in March 2013. From someone named Walter Hale to Raymond Greer. Raymond Greer, RG. The letter was brief. New protocols for accessing the facility, it said. Emphasizing environmental controls in the vault. The vault. She searched Walter Hale on her phone. 1 bar of signal, loading slowly, each line of text appearing like something being pulled up from a depth. Walter Hale, founder of Hale Systems, a software and data infrastructure company started in 1981 in Colorado Springs, grew through the 80s, sold to IBM in 1999 for $1.1 billion, known subsequently as a reclusive figure, interested in economic theory, and what one profile from 2007 called preservation philosophy, the idea that wealth should be stored in forms that would survive systemic shocks, currency crises, institutional failures. Built multiple properties around the country, locations undisclosed. Died August 9, 2018 in Colorado Springs, age 73. No surviving family. No surviving family. No wife, no children. No next of kin listed in the brief obituary she found in the Colorado Springs paper. No one to inherit. Claire put her phone down and looked at the wall. The maintenance contractor R.G. Raymond Greer had come here after Walter died and checked on the systems. As instructed, the log said. As instructed by whom, if not Walter himself? Which meant Walter had planned for the possibility of his own death, had given instructions in advance, had made sure that this place would still be running when not if. When someone came, she went back to the office, found in the bottom of the 3rd filing drawer something she had almost missed. A notebook small, its cover dark green wedged between 2 binders at the very back of the drawer. She took it out. It was a maintenance notebook, the kind with the grid paper inside, but it wasn't maintenance records in it. It was notes, in a hand different from the log entries, more considered, more personal. Walter Hale's name was on the inside front cover, in the same careful cursive she recognized from the letter fragment on the computer. She set it on the desk, and then, because it was late and the generator was running steadily, and the heat had gotten the living quarters to a temperature where she could feel her feet again, she picked it up and took it downstairs and sat on the bunk mattress and began to read. The notebook covered 2010 to 2018. Not daily entries. Walter wasn't that kind of writer. He came to the notebook when he had something to work through. Weeks would pass between entries, sometimes months. But when he wrote carefully. He wrote about his mother, Elizabeth Hale, born July 14, 1931, in a small house outside of Pueblo, the daughter of a dry goods merchant who lost his store in the Depression and never quite recovered from it financially or otherwise. She had worked 2 jobs for most of her adult life: switchboard operator during the day, seamstress at night, and then later, when the switchboard work disappeared, receptionist and seamstress, and she had raised Walter alone after his father left in 1959. She had paid for his first computer course at the community college with money she saved by eating lunch at her desk instead of the cafeteria. She had said, when he showed her the acceptance letter to the university, that she always knew. She died in 1998, 3 weeks after Walter sold his company for the first meaningful sum of money he'd ever had. She had lived long enough to know he would be okay, but not long enough to see how okay. He wrote about that. He wrote about it more than once. The timing. How close he had come to her seeing it. How in some ways it was better, because she had always been afraid of what money did to people, and he would rather she remember him as the son she understood than watch him become someone harder to recognize. He wrote about the vault. Not by name at first. In the early entries he called it the project, the preparation, what I'm building, and then, in a 2012 entry, he called it Winter Key for the first time, and it stuck. He wrote about wanting to build something that would outlast him in a way that meant something. Not a building with his name on it. Not an endowment that bureaucrats would administrate into meaninglessness. Something direct. Something that would find the person who needed it most and give it to them without asking anything in return, except that they do something with it. He wrote about the auction structure. Choosing the right listing service. The ones that attracted desperate buyers, not investors. Waiting through 3 auction cycles to see what kind of buyers the listing drew, and each time the right person did not appear. Resetting. Waiting. Trusting that eventually someone would come who was desperate enough or curious enough or brave enough to buy something they'd never seen because they needed shelter and had 750 left. Claire read that line twice. He wrote near the end, the handwriting different, slower. The letters slightly uneven in a way that suggested the hand writing them was not entirely well about what he hoped. He hoped that whoever found this place would not do what he had done, that they would not build walls around what they had, that they would use it the way he had not used his own life, openly, generously, without the specific kind of fear that had kept him alone in a mountain bunker for 20 years, with more wealth than he could spend pretending he was being careful, rather than admitting he was simply afraid. He wrote, I know you'll find the vault. I know you'll find this notebook. I left them both where someone thorough enough to look would look. If you're reading this, you're thorough. You're also probably tired and cold and trying to understand what you've stumbled into. He wrote, the code is the day she came into the world, not the day she left it. And in the margin, written in a different pen, smaller, at an angle like a thought he'd had, while reviewing what he'd written July 14, 1931, 71,431. Claire sat with the notebook in her lap for a long time. The generator hummed. The heat circulated. Somewhere in the mountain above her, snow was coming down onto the clearing, onto the concrete face of the entrance, onto the door that had opened on the 4th try. She stood up, went downstairs, walked to the end of the 3rd-level hallway, stood in front of the door with its keypad glowing red and its faded yellow warning and its 6 empty waiting spaces. She entered the first digit, 0. A soft beep, 7, beep, 1, 4, 3, 1. The screen was still for 1 second, too. She heard her own breathing. She heard the ventilation system. She heard from very far away the deep sound of the mountain being what it had always been. Then the screen turned green. Then the locks began to disengage. Not one lock. Several. She counted 6 separate sounds, each one a different pitch, like the mechanism was a chord being played by something very large and very precise. And then the door moved, not swinging open but releasing, the seals breaking with a sound like a sigh, and she pulled the handle, and the door came toward her, and cold air poured through the gap. She held her flashlight up, and then the motion sensors caught her, and the lights began to come on, fluorescent tubes in sequence, one section at a time, revealing the space in stages, the near wall first, then the middle, then the back, and what they revealed was not a room. It was something else entirely. 30 feet high at the apex, maybe 100 feet deep. Carved into the mountain itself, the natural rock visible above where the concrete stopped, the ceiling a rough dome of stone that arched overhead like the inside of a very old and deliberate thing. Glass cases along both walls, climate-controlled, their little displays showing temperature and humidity. Paintings mounted in frames with their own environmental systems. And along the back wall, floor to ceiling, row upon row of identical steel boxes, each labeled with a date and a number, the dates beginning in 1986 in the lower left and climbing upward and rightward until they reached 2017 in the upper right corner. 412 boxes. Claire stood in the doorway of the vault that Walter Hale had spent 32 years filling and looked at what he had left behind and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not relief, not excitement, not the specific feeling of a problem solved. Something older, something that sat in the chest differently. She would figure out later what to call it. For now she walked in. The vault smelled like cold metal and old paper and something faintly chemical that she couldn't name. Climate control. That was the smell. The particular quality of air that has been filtered and regulated for years, stripped of everything unpredictable, kept at precisely the temperature someone decided was correct for the preservation of things worth preserving. Claire stood just inside the doorway and let the lights finish coming on. She was a mechanic. She diagnosed things by their details. So she did that now. She walked slowly along the left wall and looked at each case without touching anything, without reaching for her phone, without doing the math. Just looking first. The way her father had taught her: before you fix it, understand it. Before you understand it, just look. The first case was coins. Not the kind you found in a drawer or inherited in a coffee can. These were organized in velvet trays, each one in its own protective capsule. Each capsule labeled in a hand she was beginning to recognize as Walter's. The labels were specific. Not just gold coin, but 1,893 Morgan dollar MS-65, Carson City. Not just old currency, but descriptions that meant something to someone who knew what they meant. She did not know what they meant yet. The second case held paper currency. Large format notes from the early 20th century. Silver certificates. Federal Reserve notes from before the aesthetic changed. Bills that looked more like engravings than money, more like art than anything you'd fold into a wallet. The third case held artwork. Not prints, not reproductions, originals. Each one mounted in its own climate-controlled frame. Each one accompanied by a small laminated card with a title and a date and a name. A harbor scene in Impressionist style. A landscape that she thought might be New England rocky coast, gray water, a light she recognized as particular to that part of the country, even though she'd only been there once. A small bronze that sat alone on a plinth inside its case. A figure caught mid-movement, frozen in the way that good sculpture freezes things without making them feel dead. She kept walking. The safe deposit boxes along the back wall began at floor level on the left and climbed to within a foot of the ceiling, extending across the full width of the vault. The lowest row was labeled 1,986 1 through 1,986 24. Above that, 1,987, a full row, and up, until the topmost row, 2017, which ended at 2017 412. 412 boxes. One man. 31 years. She did the math without meaning to. More than 13 boxes a year. More than one a month. At the center of the vault, a wooden desk. Not a folding table or a camp setup. An actual desk, solid, with a leather surface worn to softness and a chair behind it that had the particular collapse of furniture that has been sat in many times by the same body. As if Walter Hale had sat here regularly, not just to store things but to be among them, to sit in the middle of what he'd built and think. She sat in his chair. She didn't plan to. Her legs just took her there, and then she was sitting down, and the leather accepted her weight in a way that felt like something had been expecting her. In the center drawer, a ledger, thick, leather-bound in the old style with marbled end papers and a spine that had been repaired at some point, stitched back together with the kind of care you give something you intend to keep. The first page was dated January 15, 1986. The handwriting was the same careful, architectural script she recognized from the notebook upstairs, each letter formed with deliberate intention, as if Walter understood that what he wrote here would need to be legible to someone who wasn't him. Project Winter Key. The header read, Personal Asset Preservation Initiative. Below that, a paragraph of explanation. She read it slowly. He wrote about what he'd seen happen to fortunes, to currencies, to institutions that seemed permanent until they didn't. He wrote about the specific lesson of watching his mother work 2 jobs her entire life, save carefully, do everything right, and still have almost nothing when she died, not because she'd failed, but because the systems around her were indifferent to her effort. He wrote about the particular futility of that. And then he wrote about what he'd decided to do instead. He was going to build a repository, a place where value could survive anything. Gold that had been considered valuable for 5,000 years and showed no signs of stopping. Art that transcended the political systems that printed currency. Equity in companies that built things people needed. Physical assets that couldn't be deleted by a market correction or seized by a government with a different set of priorities than it had when you acquired your assets. He wrote, If I'm wrong about the fragility of these systems, if I die peacefully and civilization holds together, then someone will find this and have the means to do something beautiful. And if I'm right, then I'll have built something that can survive what's coming. She turned pages. The ledger was meticulous. Every acquisition recorded, the date, the item, the purchase price, where it came from, which box number it went into, what the estimated value was at the time of entry, and at each subsequent reassessment. He had reassessed annually until 2015, then every 6 months. The final assessment was dated March 28, 2018. 5 months before he died. She found the summary page at the back. Total asset inventory, March 2018. Gold and precious metals 47.2 million. Rare currency collection 12.4 million. Investment grade artwork 33.8 million. Bearer bonds and debt instruments 41.6 million. Stock certificates and equity positions 118.3 million. Cryptocurrency holdings 56.7 million. Total estimated value 310 million. Claire put the ledger down on the desk, picked it back up, looked at the number again, put it down again. $310 million. In a mountain, in a bunker, on land she had purchased for $750 because she needed somewhere to sleep. She looked at the ceiling of the vault, natural rock, slightly rough, the ceiling of the mountain itself. She looked at the rows of boxes. She looked at the paintings on the wall. She looked at the ledger. Then she looked at her hands. Mechanic's hands. Short nails permanently stained along the cuticles in a way that soap and a nail brush had never fully addressed. A scar across the right palm from a slip with a box cutter 6 years ago. Calloused on the inside of the thumb and the first 2 fingers from years of gripping tools. These hands had fixed a lot of things. She was not sure they were equipped for this. The envelope was at the back of the ledger drawer. She almost missed it. It had slipped to the back, held in place by the drawer's back panel, sealed with wax in a dark red that had partly cracked with age. The outside read, in Walter's hand, "To whoever finds this." She broke the seal carefully. Old wax, brittle. The letter inside was 2 pages, typed on what looked like a typewriter, the letters slightly uneven in the way of real keys, striking real ribbon, not the perfect uniformity of a printer. Dated August 1, 2018. 8 days before he died. She read it. He wrote the way he'd written in the notebook, considered. Unhurried. The letter of a man who had made his peace with the time he had, and was using what was left of it to say something he needed to say. He wrote about regret. About the specific regret of having had enormous resources, and using them primarily to build walls. About understanding, only in the last few years, that the thing he'd been afraid of, the collapse, the crisis, the moment when everything fell apart, had already happened to millions of people. He, who hadn't had the option of building a bunker, that while he'd been storing gold against a hypothetical catastrophe, real catastrophes had been happening to real people every day. and he hadn't done much about that. He wrote about his mother, about how she would have looked at what he'd built and had complicated feelings. She had been the most practical person he'd ever known. She would have understood the logic of preservation, and she would have asked what good it was doing just sitting there. And then he wrote the part Claire read 3 times. I know you're there because I prepared for you. I didn't leave this to chance. I made sure this property ended up in the right type of auction. The kind where desperate people look. Not investors, not developers. People who need something to work. I watched 3 auction cycles pass without the right person appearing. I adjusted the listing. I waited. If you found this vault, you found the notebook first. If you found the notebook, you solved the code. If you solved the code, you already know more about Elizabeth Hale than most people who knew me in life. That tells me something about you. You're thorough. You don't give up when things are hard. You found a way to make this facility work when everything in it was dormant, which means you understand systems and you aren't afraid of them. You bought something you'd never seen because you needed it badly enough. That's not recklessness. That's faith. And that tells me something too. My only request, and it is a request, not a condition, is this. Don't do what I did. Don't protect what you have by building it into a wall. Use it. Help people. Be less afraid than I was. This wealth is real. What you do with it is entirely up to you. Good luck, and thank you for caring enough to look. Walter Hale, August 1, 2018. Claire folded the letter. Put it back in the envelope. Put the envelope in the front pocket of her jacket, against her ribs, where she could feel its edges. She sat in Walter Hale's chair in the middle of Walter Hale's vault with $310 million around her and thought, okay. She turned off the lights when she left, pulled the door closed behind her, heard the locks re-engage, one by one, 6 separate sounds. The keypad cycled back to red. Still there. All of it. Still there when she came back. She climbed the stairs to the living quarters and lay on the bunk mattress and stared at the concrete ceiling and did not sleep until nearly 4 in the morning. The lawyer's name she got from Donna. 2 weeks after she opened the vault, she drove back down the mountain to Crisfield, pulled into Pierce's. Donna was behind the counter restocking the coffee station with the same methodical patience as before, and she looked up when Claire came in with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had been expecting this visit. I need a lawyer, Claire said. Property law. Maybe estate law. I'm not entirely sure what kind yet. Donna poured her a coffee without asking if she wanted one. Slid it across the counter. Daniel Rourke, she said. Colorado Springs. Office above the bakery on Terrace. He's fair. He doesn't promise things he can't deliver. You know him? Grew up here. Left for law school, came back. Donna looked at her steadily. He knew Raymond. Raymond, the maintenance contractor. The RG in the logs. Claire had been turning that piece of information over and over for 2 weeks. The way you work a loose tooth with your tongue. Donna, she said. What do you know about Raymond Greer? Donna was quiet for a moment that had a particular texture. Not evasion. Just consideration. He came in here the morning of August 22, 2018, Donna said. 13 days after Walter died. He had an envelope with him. He asked me to hold it. Said if anyone ever came asking about the Hale property, I should give it to them. Claire set her coffee cup down. 5 years, she said. 5 years. Donna met her eyes. Nobody asked until you. Do you still have it? Of course I still have it. Donna reached under the counter and produced a business envelope. White, slightly yellowed at the edges. Sealed, nothing written on the outside. I figured when the right person asked, I'd know. Claire took the envelope. How do you know I'm the right person? Donna looked at her. At the jacket she'd been wearing since she arrived. At the hands on the counter. At the expression of someone who was tired in a specific way, not from laziness or defeat, but from sustained, intentional effort. Because Walter described you, Donna said simply. Not by name. Just what kind of person? Claire opened the envelope in her truck in the parking lot, inside a formal letter. Walter Hale's name at the top, the date April 12, 2016, a notary stamp at the bottom. Below the stamp, the signature and information for a Gerald Pitt, attorney at law, Flagstaff, Arizona. The letter was addressed to Walter's estate attorneys and to any court that might subsequently find it relevant. Its language was formal and specific and completely unambiguous. It concerned a woman named Diane Hale, Walter's half-sister, and her descendants. It documented Diane's attempt to establish contact in early 2016, which Walter had recognized immediately as financially motivated. Her first contact in 37 years had coincided to the month with a Forbes profile that estimated his net worth for the first time. The letter stated, in language that had clearly been written to survive scrutiny, "I explicitly and permanently disinherit Diane Hale and all of her descendants from any asset I control or have previously controlled, including and specifically the property known as Winter Key Holdings LLC and all assets therein. This disinheritance is final and unconditional." 2 paragraphs later, furthermore, "It is my stated and documented intention that Winter Key Holdings and all associated assets pass to the individual who purchases the property at public auction following my death, provided they locate and access the vault through the means I have established. This is not an oversight in my estate planning. It is the plan." Claire read it twice. Then she put it back in the envelope. Then she sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes without starting the truck. Walter had known someone might come after whoever found the vault, had prepared for that too, had filed this letter 2 years before he died, with a notary and an attorney who were presumably still alive and reachable, and capable of confirming its authenticity. He had thought of everything, which was, somehow, the thing that got her, not the money, not the vault or the ledger or the art on the walls. The fact that this man, alone in a mountain, dying, had spent his last years thinking through every possible obstacle that might stand between his intentions and the person he hoped would receive them, and had then methodically removed each obstacle he could identify. She started the truck and drove to Colorado Springs. Daniel Rourke's office was exactly what Donna had described, above a bakery, accessible via a staircase on the outside of the building that delivered you to a landing and a door, with his name on frosted glass. The bakery smell came through the floor. It was cinnamon that morning. Maybe cardamom. She waited in a chair that had seen decades of waiting. He came out to get her himself. 54 maybe. Gray streaked through brown hair that needed cutting. Reading glasses folded into his breast pocket. Hands that did not look like lawyers' hands, the knuckles a little enlarged. The skin weathered in a way that suggested he had done different work before this work, or alongside it. He shook her hand. Firm. Professional. "Miss Whitmore. Come in." She put everything on his desk. The deed. The auction documentation. The maintenance logs. Photographs of the vault she'd taken on her phone. The master ledger's summary page also photographed. Walter's letter. And the envelope from Donna. He read for 31 minutes. She watched the clock on his wall and said nothing. He made notes on a yellow legal pad. His handwriting was fast and confident, the shorthand of someone who had been taking notes for a very long time. When he was done, he took off his reading glasses and set them on top of the stack of documents. "I need to ask you something directly," he said. "Okay. Is there anything about how you acquired this property, or what you found inside it, that is illegal, that I should know about before we proceed?" "No." She said it without hesitating because there was nothing to hesitate about. "I bought it at a government surplus auction. I've documented everything from the moment I arrived. Everything I've shown you is exactly as I found it." He looked at her for a moment. The look of a man assessing not the words but the person saying them. "All right." He picked up his pen again. "I need a day to research some case law. But here's what I can tell you right now. The property was hers. Clear. The auction had been legitimate. The estate had transferred the land. Everything within the property boundaries at time of transfer belonged to the buyer, on standard real estate law. That part was solid. The more complex question was whether Walters, through any surviving heirs, could argue that the vault's contents represented assets that should have been part of the 2019 probate proceedings. The estate had been settled based on what the attorneys knew existed. If they didn't know about Winter Key Holdings, those assets weren't part of the settlement. Which means, she said, someone with a blood claim to Walter Hale's estate might argue the vault should have been included, that they were deprived of assets they were entitled to because those assets were hidden. But the letter. He looked at the envelope, at the notary stamp, at Gerald Pitt's information. If this letter is authentic, he said, and if Gerald Pitt is still alive and able to confirm he drafted and witnessed it, then Walter's intent is documented and legally significant. He didn't accidentally exclude these assets from his estate. He deliberately structured the transfer outside of estate channels and said so explicitly in a notarized document filed with a licensed attorney 2 years before his death. Intent matters in law. Yes. Intent matters enormously. He tapped the envelope. This is the center of your case. If it comes to a case, we'd need to locate Pitt and confirm. It will come to a case? Daniel looked at her steadily. You found $310 million in a mountain. Someone will come. She drove back to the bunker that evening, parked in the clearing. Sat in the truck for a while before going in, looking at the concrete entrance in the headlights, the steel door, the ice that had partially melted and refrozen in new shapes since she'd first stood in front of it. 6 weeks ago she had been in a Walmart parking lot counting what was left. Now she was sitting outside a mountain in Teller County, with a vault code in her memory and a notarized letter in her jacket pocket and a question she didn't have an answer to yet, which was, what does a person do with this? She had been practical her whole life, because she'd had to be. Because the margin between fine and not fine had never been wide enough to accommodate impracticality. Every decision she'd made in the past 9 years had been run through the filter of what she could afford, what made sense, what could be sustained. This was outside the filter. This was in territory where the filter didn't have calibration marks. She went inside, made soup from the cans she'd brought up from Crisfield, sat at the table in the common room, with the master ledger's summary page in front of her. She'd printed a photograph of it at the copy shop in town and looked at the numbers until they stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like a different kind of problem, not a financial problem. Those were solvable. Daniel would handle the legal structure. Sandra Voss and the IRS would eventually be satisfied by full disclosure and proper reporting, which was the only approach she was willing to take. The mechanics of converting physical assets to usable wealth were complex but not mysterious. There were professionals for that. And professionals cost a percentage, and that percentage was fine. The problem was different. The problem was Walter's letter, the part she kept coming back to. Don't do what I did. He had spent 32 years being afraid, had channeled all of that fear into construction, into accumulation, into building higher and higher walls around himself and his resources. And at the end of it, he sat alone in this vault and wrote a letter to a stranger and said, I wasted it. Not the money, the time, the possibility of what this could have been while I was still alive to see it. She did not intend to waste it. She was still working out what that meant exactly. But she intended to work it out. She was on her 3rd cup of coffee the next morning when the knock came on the outer door, which was wrong. Nobody knew she was here. Frank Calloway knew, in the vague sense that he'd given her the keys, but he'd shown no further interest in the property's new owner. Donna knew she was up here somewhere. Nobody else had been given the location. She climbed to the entry chamber and worked the locks and opened the outer door. A man in a charcoal gray suit was standing in her clearing. 47 maybe. Dark hair going silver at the temples, cut short and well. The suit was the kind that cost more than her monthly rent had been. His shoes were excellent and currently ruined by the snow, which told her he had either not anticipated this or had not cared enough to change them. A black Mercedes SUV was parked behind her truck, and it was the kind of clean that required regular professional attention. He looked at her, assessed. Claire Whitmore, he said. Not a question. Yes. My name is Preston Hale. Walter Hale was my uncle. She looked at him, at the suit, at the eyes which were doing a very quick and careful inventory of the entrance, of what was visible behind her, of the quality of the structure she was standing in front of. Come in, she said, because refusing to let him in would be worse than hearing what he'd come to say. He didn't look at the entry chamber with the curiosity of someone seeing it for the first time. He looked at it with the particular blandness of a person maintaining a performance of casualness. He sat in the common room across from her, at the table she had been eating meals at for 3 weeks, and he put a folder on the table, and he smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. I'll be direct, he said. I know what's down there. I know approximately what it's worth. And I know you purchased this property legally at auction. He paused. I'm not here to dispute the property, just the contents. The contents were never part of the sale. They represent assets belonging to Walter Hale's estate that were excluded from probate, not through proper estate planning but through deliberate concealment. As his surviving blood relative, I have standing to contest. He opened the folder, pushed it across the table. A legal filing. Teller County Court. Preston Hale versus Claire Whitmore. Already filed. Already in the system. She looked at it. Read the first page without rushing. I'm a reasonable man, Preston said. Litigation is expensive and slow, and the outcome is genuinely uncertain for both parties. I'm prepared to settle, he waited a beat. 80% to me. You keep 20%. At current valuations, that's still $62 million, Miss Whitmore. More than enough for a very comfortable life. She looked up from the filing. I need to talk to my lawyer, she said. Of course. He stood, smoothed his jacket. I'd encourage you not to wait too long. The longer this sits in litigation, the more attorneys take from both sides. He left a business card on the table. My attorney's information. Have yours call mine. He walked to the door, stopped, and I'd advise against liquidating any assets before this is resolved. Courts take a dim view of that. He left. She heard his footsteps in the entry chamber, heard the outer door open and close, heard the engine of the Mercedes start and the sound of it backing out through the trees. She sat at the table and looked at the business card. Preston Hale, attorney at law, a Denver address, a phone number. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She called Daniel. Don't talk to him again without me present, Daniel said. And don't touch anything in the vault. I wasn't planning to. I know. I'm saying it anyway. A pause. Pull his bar record. Call me back. She had signal barely. From the entry chamber with the outer door cracked, she searched Preston Hale, Colorado Bar Association, and then added Illinois because something about the Denver address felt secondary, like a forwarding address, rather than a home base. Illinois Bar Association records. Preston Hale. Admitted 2001. Disciplinary action. 2019. Temporary suspension. 18 months. Conflict of interest. Representing adverse interests in an estate dispute without disclosure. Reinstated 2021. An estate dispute. She stared at that for a long time. He had done this before. Not this exactly, but something in the same family positioned himself between a deceased person's intentions and the legal machinery of their estate, and found the gaps and worked them. She called Daniel back. He was suspended in Illinois, she said. Estate conflict of interest. 2019. A silence. That's useful, Daniel said. It establishes pattern. It won't win the case by itself, but it will matter. Another pause. Claire. How much did you know about Preston Hale before today? Nothing. Then here's what I know. Walter Hale died without, as far as his estate attorneys were concerned, any surviving family. No siblings, no children, nobody. The estate was settled on that basis. If Preston Hale is now claiming to be a nephew, either the estate attorneys failed to locate him or he wasn't known to exist, or he deliberately stayed off the radar during probate and is now surfacing because he's found out what was in the vault. The third one, she said. Almost certainly the third one. She could hear him writing. Which means he's not coming from a position of wronged family member who was overlooked. He's coming from a position of opportunist who waited to see what emerged and is now making a move. Does that matter legally? It matters for how we present the case. It matters for the judge. It won't be the deciding factor. He stopped writing. The deciding factor is Pitt. I'm going to contact Gerald Pitt tomorrow morning. She went back inside, back down to the common room, sat at the table with Preston's card still in front of her. $62 million. He'd said it like it was a reasonable offer, like she should feel grateful, like the choice was between that and nothing. She thought about her father's tools, the pawn shop on Morrison Road, the $400 in her hand in the parking lot after. She thought about the entry in the maintenance log. August 22, 2018, just R. Someone who had come here 13 days after Walter died, had verified the systems, had left as instructed, and had given Donna an envelope to hold for the person who would eventually ask questions. Someone had believed she would come. or that someone like her would come. Someone had prepared for it. She picked up Preston's business card, looked at it. Then she put it in the folder with the legal filing and closed the folder and put it on the shelf where she kept documents she needed to deal with but didn't want to look at. She went back to work. The weeks that followed had a particular quality she would later have difficulty describing. Pressure, but not panic. Forward motion, but not speed. She had always done her best work when the situation was serious enough to require her full attention, and this situation was requiring it. Daniel filed a formal response to Preston's claim. He contacted Gerald Pitt in Flagstaff, who was 78, retired, and still entirely clear on the letter he had drafted for Walter Hale in April of 2016. Pitt agreed to provide an affidavit and, if necessary, testimony. The IRS arrived in the form of Sandra Voss, who came to the bunker on a Wednesday morning in a dark sedan and sat in the common room with a briefcase and a professional thoroughness that reminded Claire of a very organized doctor delivering results she wasn't going to enjoy hearing. Sandra was 50, roughly. Pale hair cut short. The kind of face that revealed nothing during working hours. Miss Whitmore, I'm conducting a review of certain financial activity associated with your name and tax ID over the past 8 weeks. Specifically, charitable donations totaling $85,000 distributed to 3 local organizations. I know what I gave, Claire said. Your combined income for the past 3 tax years is $81,000. Your most recent filing showed 0 income. Sandra opened her briefcase and set a stack of forms on the table. I'd like to understand where $85,000 came from. Personal savings. Sandra looked at her. The look of a woman who has been lied to in many creative ways over a long career and has developed excellent detection equipment. Miss Whitmore, she said carefully, personal savings accumulated on an income of $81,000 over 3 years, during which you also paid rent, living expenses, and eventually lost your income entirely, do not typically include $85,000 available for charitable distribution. No, Claire agreed. They don't. A pause. I found something in the property I purchased, Claire said. I am working with an attorney to document everything properly and report it correctly. I made those donations from a small amount I accessed before fully understanding the legal and tax implications. I've since stopped accessing anything until the legal process is complete. Sandra looked at her for a moment. That's a better answer than I usually get, she said. I'd like the name of your attorney. Daniel Rourke. Colorado Springs. She wrote it down. We'll be in contact. I need full documentation, acquisition records, legal filings, appraisal documentation when available, submitted within 45 days. You'll have it in 30. Sandra paused in the act of closing her briefcase. Most people in your position try to hide what they've found, she said. Not unkindly, just observationally. I know. Claire looked at her steadily. That's not how I was raised. Something moved in Sandra Voss's face. Not softening exactly. More like a small recalibration. 30 days, she said. We'll be in touch. She left. Sheriff Dale Brewer came the following week. A courtesy call, he said, because that's what it was in the technical sense. He was not arresting her, not charging her, not doing anything except standing in her common room with his hat in his hands and asking questions in the measured tone of a man who had 30 years of experience having conversations that could go either way. He was 52, a broad face, eyes that were warmer than his professional manner suggested. I've received some inquiries, he said, about the property, about the donations, about you. He paused. You understand I have to ask. I understand, Claire said. Ask, he asked. She answered. She did not tell him anything she hadn't already told Sandra Voss, which was the truth in its most condensed form. She had found something valuable. She was documenting it properly. She was cooperating with all relevant authorities. You're not worried? Brewer said. Not an accusation, just a question. About what specifically? About any of it. She thought about it, actually thought about it, which she could see surprised him slightly. I'm a mechanic, she said finally. When something's broken, you find out what's wrong, you address it, and you move forward. I don't know of anything I've done wrong. So no, I'm not worried. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. Put his hat back on. We'll be in touch if we need anything further. The hearing was set for a Tuesday. The night before, Claire went down to the vault. Not to take anything. Not to count or catalog or plan. She just needed to see it. She turned on the lights and walked the full length of it slowly, the way you walk through a space you're trying to commit to memory. The coins in their cases. The artwork with its temperature monitors. The boxes along the back wall, climbing from 1986 to 2017, like the rings of a tree. 31 years. She thought about the day Walter had placed the first box, 1986-1. What he had been thinking. Whether he had known, even then, that this was going to become what it became, or whether it had started smaller than that, a practical decision, and then grown year by year into something that had taken on its own meaning. She thought about her father's tools, about what it meant to build something slowly, piece by piece, over years, with the intention that it would outlast you. She turned off the lights. She pulled the door closed. She heard the locks engage. She climbed the stairs and went to sleep. And in the morning she drove to Colorado Springs and walked into the Teller County Courthouse and sat down next to Daniel Rourke and waited. The courthouse in Colorado Springs was the kind of building that meant to impress you. Granite steps, high ceilings inside, the particular echo of hard floors and stone walls that made every footstep sound deliberate. Claire had been in courtrooms before, once for a traffic matter, and once as a witness in a friend's small claims case. And both times she'd felt the architecture doing something intentional, arranging you into the correct emotional posture. Small, accountable, subject to something larger than yourself. She sat next to Daniel and felt the architecture working on her and refused to let it. Preston was already there. 3 lawyers from Denver with matching leather portfolios. Expensive haircuts. The kind of professional confidence that came from billing $400 an hour and winning often enough that the losses didn't dent anything important. Preston himself sat at the end of their table and looked at the wood surface in front of him with the focused expression of a man running calculations. He didn't look at Claire. She looked at him. Judge Martha Aldridge came in and everyone stood and then sat, and the room settled into the particular attention of a space where things were about to be decided. 63. Aldridge was. Gray hair, rimless glasses, the face of someone who had been presented with human problems in their most complicated forms for 30 years and had developed a comprehensive immunity to performance. She looked at Preston's team. She looked at Daniel. She looked at Claire. Then she opened the file in front of her and started reading. Preston's lead attorney was a man named Sutherland, Richard Sutherland, with a voice that had been trained somewhere expensive to project both authority and reasonableness simultaneously. He presented his case in sections, each one clean and organized, the way a person presents who has practiced this presentation several times. First, the genealogy. Preston's mother, Carol Hale, had been Walter Hale's half-sister. Different mothers. Walter's father had remarried after the death of Walter's mother, and Carol had been the daughter of that second marriage, younger by 11 years. The family had not been close, Sutherland acknowledged this, but the blood connection was documented. Birth certificates, DNA testing results, a family tree laid out on a board that an assistant placed at the front of the room. Second, the probate argument. Walter Hale's estate had been settled in 2019 based on information available to his estate attorneys at the time. Winter Key Holdings LLC had not appeared in any documentation provided to the estate. The property had been filed under a series of shell corporations that had obscured Walter's ownership. The estate attorneys, operating in good faith, had listed the property as a minor asset, undeveloped land, Teller County, valued at approximately $5,000, and sold it accordingly. Third, the standing argument. Under Colorado intestate succession law, when a deceased individual has no surviving spouse or children, the estate passes to siblings, or if siblings are deceased, to their descendants. Preston Hale was Walter's nephew. Carol Hale had died in 2017. Preston was her only child, which made him, under the standard application of Colorado law, the rightful heir to assets that should have been part of the estate's settlement. Sutherland paused here. Let it sit. The vault and its contents, he said, represent assets belonging to Walter Hale's estate. Miss Whitmore purchased the land. She did not purchase what was inside it. And under the law, what was inside it belongs to the man who put it there, and therefore to his legitimate heir. He sat down. Daniel stood up. He was not impressive in the way Sutherland was impressive. He did not have the suit or the practiced delivery or the assistant with the board. He had a yellow legal pad with handwritten notes and a stack of documents held together with a binder clip, and the unhurried manner of a man who was not performing confidence because he didn't need to. He started with the property law. Basic, clear, the kind of argument that didn't need ornamentation. Claire had purchased the property legally. Everything within the property's boundaries at time of transfer belonged to her as the new owner. That was standard real estate law in Colorado, and in every other state that had real estate law, which was all of them. Then he moved to intent. Your Honor, he said, the question before this court is not whether Preston Hale has a technical blood claim to Walter Hale's estate. The question is whether Walter Hale intended for these assets to pass through estate channels at all. He submitted the maintenance logs, submitted the Shell Corporation documentation going back to 1996, submitted Walter's journal, the relevant pages bookmarked, and then he submitted the envelope, Donna's envelope, the one Raymond Greer had given her, the notarized letter, dated April 12, 2016. He handed the original to the court clerk and a copy to Sutherland. I'd like to read the relevant section for the record, Daniel said. Sutherland looked at his copy. Something changed in his expression. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening. Daniel read it aloud. The formal legal language of Walter's disinheritance. Each clause deliberate, the final paragraph, the one about Winter Key Holdings, specifically delivered without editorial inflection, just the words. Walter's words, written 2 years before he died, witnessed by a licensed attorney, notarized, filed with the Colorado Bar Association. The room was quiet. Judge Aldridge was looking at her copy, reading it herself, not just listening. Preston had gone very still. Not the stillness of a person at rest, the stillness of a person maintaining control over something that wanted to move. Your Honor, Daniel continued, Gerald Pitt, the attorney who drafted and witnessed this letter, is available to testify by video deposition. He is 78 years old and residing in Flagstaff, Arizona, but he is in good health and has provided a sworn affidavit confirming the letter's authenticity and his memory of the circumstances under which it was created. He submitted the affidavit. Walter Hale did not accidentally exclude Preston Hale's family from his estate. He explicitly and deliberately excluded them. He de-documented that exclusion with legal specificity. He used shell corporations not to defraud anyone, but to ensure that the assets he had spent 31 years accumulating would transfer outside of estate channels to whoever found and accessed them precisely as he intended. He sat down. Judge Aldridge took off her glasses, put them on the desk. Looked at Preston, Mr. Hale, she said. Your uncle documented his intentions regarding you and your family explicitly, and 2 years in advance of his death. Were you aware of this letter? Preston looked at the table. Mr. Hale. I was aware, he said, that a letter of that nature had been discussed. Not written, not filed, discussed. Judge Aldridge looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Sutherland. Counsel, you presented a claim on behalf of your client based on intestate succession law. You are now aware of a notarized disinheritance document filed with the Colorado Bar Association 2 years prior to your client's death. Do you wish to request a continuance to review this evidence? Sutherland was already in quiet, rapid conversation with the second attorney at his table. He straightened. We would request a continuance, Your Honor, to assess the authenticity. The document has been authenticated by its author, a licensed attorney, via sworn affidavit, Aldridge said, and it has been on file with the Colorado Bar Association for 8 years. Continuance denied. She put her glasses back on. Robert Walter Hale's intent is clearly documented. He explicitly disinherited the Hale family line through Carol Hale and her descendants. He separately documented his intent for the Winter Key Holdings property to transfer to whoever purchased it at public auction. Miss Whitmore purchased the property legally, accessed the vault through the means Mr. Hale established, and is in the process of properly reporting and documenting all assets to the relevant authorities. She looked at Preston. Mr. Hale, your claim has no legal basis in light of this documentation. The motion to contest ownership is denied. The gavel. The sound was smaller than she expected. A wooden sound. Practical. Preston stood. His chair scraped back on the floor. His face had gone the color of something that hadn't been outside in a while. This is... He started. Sutherland was on his feet, one hand on Preston's arm. Not here. They left, not quickly enough to look panicked, but not slowly enough to look dignified. The three attorneys and Preston Hale moving toward the door in a cluster, the quiet but unmistakable energy of a group that needed to be somewhere else before anyone asked them additional questions. The door closed. Claire sat at the table and looked at the front of the courtroom and breathed. Daniel was gathering his papers, unhurried, the same way he'd presented them. "Congratulations," he said. "It's yours." She was not ready to say anything yet, so she nodded. Outside the courthouse, Donna was standing at the bottom of the granite steps. Claire had not known she was coming. But there she was, in a coat that was heavy enough for the weather, and practical enough for the woman wearing it. And when she saw Claire come through the door, she nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to be confirmed. Claire walked down to her. "How did you know?" Claire asked. "Daniel called me last night, told me what he had." Donna's eyes moved over Claire's face, reading something. "You okay?" "Getting there. That's good enough for now." Sheriff Brewer was at the bottom of the steps too. He had attended as a professional courtesy, or so he said. He shook Claire's hand. "Miss Whitmore, owe you an apology. I had to ask the questions I asked. I know you were doing your job." "I was." He looked at her steadily. "You'll want security up at that property. Word's going to get out. I can have a deputy patrol the road regularly, but you should think about a proper system." "I'll think about it." He put his hat back on. "Good luck." Sandra Voss was waiting by her sedan in the courthouse parking lot. This was the part Claire had been steeling herself for since the hearing began. Because the judge's ruling resolved the legal contest, but it did not resolve the IRS, and the IRS operated on a different timeline and with a different set of concerns. Sandra looked at her without expression. "Congratulations on the ruling," she said. "Thank you now." Sandra opened the back door of her sedan and produced a folder. "About the tax situation." Here it was. "I've reviewed your documentation," Sandra said. "All of it. The acquisition records, the property transfer, the legal filings, Mr. Rourke's tax structuring proposal, the initial appraisals." She held the folder without opening it. "You've been completely transparent throughout this process. More transparent than required. You've flagged potential liability before it was identified. You've over-reported rather than under-reported." Claire waited. "The audit is closed," Sandra said. "Your tax liability upon liquidation of assets will be handled through the structured reporting plan your attorney submitted. Quarterly estimates, full disclosure, the schedule we discussed." She paused. "You're going to pay an enormous amount of tax, Miss Whitmore. I know. Most people in your position hire someone to minimize that." "It's the law," Claire said. "I'm not interested in minimizing the law." Sandra looked at her, and something happened in Sandra Voss's face that was subtle but real, not softening, not warmth exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has been doing a difficult job for a long time, and occasionally, rarely, encounters someone who makes the job easier by simply behaving correctly. "Good luck," Sandra said. She got in her sedan and drove away. Daniel appeared at Claire's shoulder. "Coffee?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Somewhere that isn't here." They sat in a diner 3 blocks from the courthouse, formica tables. The kind of coffee that arrived in a ceramic mug that weighed something. Daniel put both hands around his and looked at her. "You understand what happens now," he said. "I keep documenting. I start the liquidation process. I pay taxes on everything. I figure out what I'm going to do with what's left. The last part," he said. "That's the part I can't help you with." "I know." He looked at his coffee. Walter was a complicated man. I didn't know him personally, but Raymond talked about him, said he was the most prepared person he'd ever met, and also the loneliest. Raymond. There it was, the name she'd been waiting for him to say. "How do you know Raymond Greer?" she said. Daniel set his mug down. "He raised me," he said. "Not he wasn't my father. My father left when I was 9. Raymond was our neighbor. He used to come over on Saturday mornings and help my mother with things that needed doing. Stayed for breakfast. Started staying longer. When I was about 12, he taught me how to fix the car. A pause. Taught me a lot of things. He was the one who said I should go to law school. She looked at him. He never told you about Walter's property. He mentioned Walter. Said he'd worked for a private client in the mountains for 20 years. Never said more than that. Daniel looked out the diner window. When Walter died, Raymond went up there one last time. He told me afterward, when I asked why he looked tired, that he'd gone to check on something for a friend. That was all. August 22, 2018. Just R, written quickly, as instructed. He wanted to make sure it was ready, Claire said. He wanted to make sure it was ready, Daniel agreed. For whoever came. She drove back to the bunker that afternoon. The mountain road, the trees closing in, the clearing appearing at the end of it with the concrete entrance and the door she had come to think of as ordinary. Which was remarkable given that 3 weeks ago it had been the most forbidding thing she had ever considered entering. She went inside, all the way down to the vault. She turned on the lights and walked the length of it one more time. The cases, the boxes, the desk at the center. She sat in Walter's chair, and for the first time since she'd found this place, she let herself actually feel it. Not the pressure, not the problem, not the legal structure or the tax liability or the question of what to do next. Just the fact of it. She had driven to a mountain with 750, and the conviction that somewhere inside a building she'd never seen there was a floor she could sleep on, and there had been, and the floor had come with running water and electricity, and a generator and a vault full of $310 million, and a letter from a dead man asking her to do something he hadn't known how to do himself. She had been prepared to survive. He had prepared her to do more than that. That night she sat at the kitchen table with Walter's letter in front of her, and a blank notepad and a pen, and she started writing. Not a plan exactly, more like a list of what she knew. She knew what it meant to be skilled at something and still lose everything. She knew what the specific fear tasted like when the math stopped working. She knew what it was to sleep in a parking lot and wake up and have to decide, every single morning, to keep going anyway. She knew what people needed when they were in that place. Not sympathy, not lectures about resilience, not forms to fill out, a floor, a door that locked, a hot shower, a job that treated them like someone who could do it. Those were things she could provide, not to everyone, not to infinity, but to more people than zero, which was the number she'd been able to help when she had nothing. She wrote until midnight. Then she folded the pages and put them next to Walter's letter. She went to sleep. The weeks after the ruling had a different quality than the weeks before. Less pressure, more weight. The pressure had been external: Preston, the IRS. The hearing and external pressure, while unpleasant, was at least straightforward. You identified it, you addressed it, you removed it. The weight was hers. She began working with Daniel on the liquidation structure. Careful, sequenced, starting small and building. The first sale was a portion of the rare coin collection. 20 coins from the 1,986 boxes. Gold, well documented. Sold through a reputable dealer in Denver who had authenticated them and provided a clean paper trail. The transaction took 3 weeks from introduction to completion. The net after capital gains, a little over $1.2 million. In her account. Real. Spendable. She looked at the account balance for a long time when it appeared. Then she started making calls. The house in Crisfield took 2 weeks to find. 3 bedrooms. A yard that had gone to grass and weeds but had good bones under the neglect. A kitchen big enough to actually work in. $265,000, paid in full, no financing, which made the seller's realtor visibly uncertain about how to process this. Cash buyers were not common in Crisfield, and cash buyers in their early 30s even less so. She moved in on a Saturday. Her possessions still fit in the truck with room left over. That would change, but not yet. For now she put her work clothes in the closet, and her spare set of tools. She had purchased a new set, not Snap-on, not yet, but good tools in the garage, and she stood in the empty kitchen and looked at the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink and thought, okay, this is where it starts. She bought a used Toyota that had high miles but a clean maintenance record and drove it back from Denver without incident. The Civic she donated to a family in the Springs that Daniel had identified through a community services organization he knew. A mother, 2 kids in school, the kind of situation where having a car meant the difference between keeping a job and not. The title transfer happened on a Wednesday. Claire watched the woman sign the paperwork, and then look at the car in the lot, and then back at the papers, and Claire could read very clearly, in the careful way the woman was keeping her face neutral, that she was working very hard not to cry in front of a stranger. Claire understood that. The particular effort of that. She'd done it herself. She drove back to Crisfield in the Toyota and started looking at commercial real estate. The garage on Main Street had been empty for 2 years. It was a solid building. Claire knew solid buildings now, in a way she hadn't before. Good infrastructure, the right ceiling height for lifts, a layout that could be reconfigured without major work. The previous tenant had run an auto repair shop out of it for 22 years before retiring and moving to his daughter's place in New Mexico. The equipment was gone, but the bones were right. She purchased it and spent 6 weeks working on it. Not alone, she hired local contractors, 2 of them, paid them fairly, told them what she wanted, and then got out of their way except when their work touched on mechanical systems, at which point she got directly in their way in the most useful possible sense. Lifts, diagnostic equipment. A tool station along the back wall, pegboards installed at her specific measurements. She had very specific opinions about pegboard height, and a set of basic tools hung in the order she'd learned them, which was the order that made sense to her, and which she would teach to the people who came to work here. White walls. Not gray, not beige. White. So the space felt clean and the light reflected properly, and you could see what you were doing. She hung photographs. Old cars, American ones, from the decades when American cars were built with the confidence of people who believed the future was going to require a lot of driving. A 1955 Thunderbird, a 1967 Mustang, a 1969 Camaro. Not because she was sentimental about the past, but because beauty mattered in a workspace. Her father had known that. Had kept a calendar of classic cars in his shop until it fell apart, and then replaced it. The sign went up on a Wednesday morning in April. Whitmore Automotive. Honest work. Fair prices. Second chances. The last line was not a slogan. It was a commitment she was making in public, where it could be held against her. Walt Kowalski appeared on a Thursday. 49. Military bearing that had been slightly compressed by whatever the years since the army had put him through. Iraq veteran, 2 tours and a mechanic for the duration of his service, the kind of mechanic who had kept vehicles running in conditions that were not conducive to vehicle maintenance. PTSD that he described, when she asked directly, as intermittent and managed and not fully managed. He had held 6 jobs since his discharge, and lost 5 of them to the same cluster of symptoms, the sudden absences, the days when the ordinary sounds of a shop floor became something else, the hypervigilance that made it difficult to work alongside people who moved unpredictably. He stood in the doorway of Whitmore Automotive and looked at the space with eyes that swept the room in one continuous motion. Corners, windows, the 2 other people present before settling on Claire. The apprenticeship, he said. Is it real? Not a question exactly. A challenge. The challenge of someone who had been told yes, and had it mean nothing too many times to treat the word as information anymore. Real, Claire said. I've got mechanical background. Army, 8 years. But shops don't always want someone who zones out sometimes. She looked at him, at the way he was standing straight, weight evenly distributed, the posture of someone who had been trained to maintain composure, and was maintaining it deliberately. Tomorrow, she said. 7 a.m. work boots. He looked at her for a moment. That's it? That's it. He was there at 6:50 the next morning. She was already under a hood. The first 2 weeks were good. Walt was skilled, genuinely skilled, with the diagnostic instincts of someone who had learned mechanics under conditions that didn't allow for guessing. And he worked clean and he worked hard and he showed up on time every day. The 3rd Monday he didn't show up. No call, no text, nothing. Claire kept his station, put his work orders aside. When he appeared the following Wednesday, she looked up from what she was doing. You're late, she said. He looked like he expected something worse than that. Yeah. Get your apron. There's a Subaru that's been on the lift since Tuesday. She didn't ask what had happened. She'd decided she wasn't going to ask, because the question would put him in the position of explaining himself to someone who held his livelihood, and she knew what that felt like, and she didn't want to be the person who created that feeling in someone else. He put his apron on and went to the Subaru. By the third month, Walt was doing something she recognized from her own early years in the shop. He was narrating his diagnostic process out loud. Not to her, not really to himself. Talking through what he was hearing, what he was feeling in the components, what the data was telling him. And the newer apprentice, a 26-year-old named Chris, who had come to her through a veterans organization and had no mechanical background at all, had started hovering near Walt's station, learning. By proximity. Walt didn't notice he was teaching. That was the part she found most remarkable. He was so inside the work that he didn't register the effect he was having. She didn't point it out. Some things worked better when they weren't named. She went back to the bunker regularly. Not to live there, she had the house now, and the house was where she was supposed to be, was learning to be. But to work. The vault required ongoing management, documentation, appraisals, the careful, sequenced process of converting physical assets into liquid wealth that could then be used for actual things. She worked with an appraiser Daniel had connected her to, a woman named Helen who had credentials that covered coins and precious metals and art, and who came to the mountain every 2 weeks and sat in the vault with a laptop and a loupe and worked through the inventory with the focused pleasure of someone doing exactly the work they were meant to do. The estimates were, in several cases, higher than Walter's last assessment. Some of the stock positions had performed significantly in the years since he'd closed his ledger. One of the technology holdings had split twice. The cryptocurrency was more volatile, some up, some effectively worthless, and she'd made the decision, with Daniel's guidance, to liquidate it early before its value could move further in either direction. The total, after Helen's updated assessment, came to $322 million. She sat with that number, and then she went back to her list, the one she'd written the night after the hearing. What she knew, what she could provide. The Hale Foundation was incorporated in March, named for Walter, because he had asked her to do something with this, and she wanted him to know, wherever he was or wasn't, that she had. The Transitional Housing Building was a brick structure on Main Street, formerly a clothing store that had closed when the highway rerouted traffic away from Crisfield Center 15 years ago. 3 stories. 6 apartments per floor. More space than she needed right now, and exactly the space she intended to fill eventually. She renovated 2 floors first. Furnished the apartments herself. Not extravagantly, she had strong opinions about what people actually needed when they were coming back from nothing. And unnecessary decorative objects were not on that list, but good mattresses were, and kitchen equipment that worked, and bathrooms with pressure and hot water, and locks on the doors that the occupant controlled. Free for 1 year. No credit check, no background required. A single commitment asked try. The first family moved in on a Tuesday in June. She met them in the parking lot, because she wanted to be there when they saw the apartment for the first time. Not to make the moment about herself, just because she remembered what it had felt like to go from sleeping in a vehicle to having a door that locked, and she wanted to be in the room with that. There was a moment when the woman walked into the bedroom and stood in the center of it, just stood, not moving, just absorbing the fact of it when Claire had to look at the wall for a while. She understood exactly what was happening in that woman's body. She had felt it herself, in a generator room in a mountain, when the lights came on. The shape of relief when you have stopped holding your breath. The late nights that followed were for the work that didn't have a name yet, the part where she sat at the kitchen's table in her house in Crisfield and tried to build structures for things that didn't have good structures yet, a referral system for the apprenticeship program, a legal framework for the housing that protected both the occupants and the foundation. A relationship with the community college in Colorado Springs that Daniel had suggested, and that had resulted in 3 very long meetings and eventually a partnership that let her offer certified credit alongside the hands-on training. She was not naturally an administrator. She was a mechanic. She preferred the problem that was in front of her, that she could touch, that gave her feedback she could read. But she learned. Because the alternative was letting someone else build the structure. Someone else build the structure. And she had seen enough structures built by people who didn't understand the problem from the inside to know that the inside knowledge mattered. She was at the garage one Tuesday evening late. The regular hours done. Chris and the other apprentices gone home working through the month's intake records when she heard the outer door. She looked up. Preston Hale stood in the doorway, but different. No suit. Jeans that had been worn many times and not recently purchased. A jacket that had been good once and had continued being used past that point. The car she could see parked at the curb through the window was a 10-year-old Ford sedan, not the black Mercedes. He looked, without the suit, like a man of 47 who had had a bad year. He looked, without the calculated expression, like a person who was tired. She put her pen down. "I'm not here about the case," he said immediately. "The case is over, I know that. Okay, I owe you an apology." She waited. He came in, stood near the door, not approaching the desk, not sitting down uninvited, just standing at a distance that was respectful or possibly cautious. "When I came here in January," he said, "I had nothing left. My investment firm had been failing for 2 years. I had debt I couldn't service. I had a mortgage I was 3 months behind on." He looked at the floor. "When I found out about the vault through a connection I'd maintained from before, someone who'd been peripherally involved in Walter's estate administration, I saw it as the only option left." "You thought it was yours." "I told myself it was mine." "That's not the same thing." He looked up. "I knew about the disinheritance, not the specifics, not the filing, but I knew Walter had cut off my mother's side of the family years ago. I was betting the documentation wasn't clean enough to matter." She was watching his face, looking for the performance, looking for the angle. She didn't see one, which didn't mean there wasn't one, but she didn't see it. "What happened?" she said. "The legal fees finished what the firm had started. The firm let me go when the case went public conflict of interest, they said, but mainly bad publicity. My wife," he stopped, started again. "My wife saw what I was willing to do. She left, took our kids to her sister's in Boulder." He reached into his jacket and took out an envelope. He set it on the workbench without pushing it toward her. $800, he said. "It's everything that's not committed to paying down the debt. I know it doesn't touch what you spent on legal fees, but I wanted you to have it." She looked at the envelope. $800. Exactly what she'd had in the Walmart parking lot in December. The number didn't mean anything to him. He couldn't know. But she knew. "Keep it," she said. He looked at her. "The Hale Foundation needs a case manager," she said. "Someone to sit across from people in crisis and actually understand it. Not from a training program, from personal experience." Silence. $45,000 a year, she said. "Health insurance. Colorado Springs office. Monday morning, 8 a.m. "Why would you?" "Because Walter gave me something I hadn't earned and asked me to do something with it." She picked up her pen. "I'm doing something with it. What you do with it after that is your call." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he said, "Monday morning," and he left. She sat in the quiet of the garage after he was gone, and looked at the workbench and the envelope still sitting on it, and the $800 inside it, and the particular quality of the silence in a shop at the end of the day. She thought about Walter, alone in his vault, with 31 years of careful accumulation around him, writing a letter to someone he'd never meet, and asking them to do better than he had. She thought she understood now what he'd been asking. Not to give the money away. Not to be generous in some grand theatrical sense. Just to keep moving. To keep showing up. To do the work in front of you, without waiting for the moment when it felt significant enough. The significant moments, in her experience, only revealed themselves afterward. In the middle, they just looked like showing up. She put the envelope in her desk drawer. She went back to the intake records. October came to Crisfield the way it always did in the mountains. Not gradually. Not with the polite warning of lower elevations where autumn arrives as a slow conversation between green and gold. Here it came overnight, decisively, the way large things happen when you're not watching. Claire woke one morning in the second week of October to find the aspen grove behind her house had gone entirely yellow in the night, and the light through her kitchen window was amber in a way that said this season didn't intend to stay long. She made coffee, stood at the window with it, watched the aspens move in a wind she couldn't feel from inside. 9 months. She didn't do the math out loud. But it was there, running in the background, the way certain calculations always ran, the quiet accounting of someone who had spent years knowing exactly how much she had and how far it needed to stretch. 9 months since the auction. 9 months since she'd driven 4 hours up a mountain road to a piece of property she'd never seen. 9 months since a key had gone into a lock and not turned, and not turned, and not turned, and then turned. She drank her coffee and watched the aspens and didn't try to make it mean anything specific. It didn't need to mean anything. It had simply happened, and then the things after it had simply happened. And here she was, in a kitchen that was hers, with a window that faced east and a grove of aspens that had gone yellow overnight without asking anyone's permission. She put on her work boots and drove to the garage. Walt was already there. He was always already there, which had surprised her the first several mornings and then stopped surprising her entirely because she understood now what the shop was for him. Not just employment, structure. The logic of a space where problems had sources and sources could be found, and things that were broken could be made to work again. Walt Kowalski had spent 8 years keeping vehicles running in conditions that were not designed for vehicle maintenance, and the instinct for it hadn't left him. What had left him temporarily and then in waves was the belief that civilian life would make room for that instinct. Whitmore Automotive made room. He was under a 2004 F-150 when she arrived, narrating to himself in the low, continuous murmur she'd come to think of as his working voice. The sound of a mind engaging with a problem, talking itself through the steps, not performing for anyone. She changed into her work clothes and pulled the intake board off the wall and checked the morning's schedule without interrupting him. 3 vehicles scheduled, 2 from yesterday still waiting on parts. A message from a woman in the valley who'd found them through the community college partnership, a van that needed work she couldn't afford. Claire wrote that one on a separate note and put it in her apron pocket. The foundation had a fund for exactly this. She paid the shop rate from the foundation account and charged the client nothing. It didn't scale to infinity, but it scaled enough to and mattering was the metric she'd decided to use. Chris came in at 7:15 and apologized for the 15 minutes, with the earnestness of a young man who took punctuality seriously enough that a quarter-hour gap genuinely bothered him. She told him the Subaru on the second lift was his for the morning. He got his apron and his tools and went to it without needing additional direction. 3 months ago, she'd had to show him how to hold a torque wrench correctly. Now he was rebuilding a suspension system from the component up, making decisions, catching his own errors before she saw them. This was the part that still stopped her sometimes. Not the vault or the legal battle or the number in the foundation's account. This, the part where a skill moved from one person to another and was now in the world in a new place, available to be used by someone who hadn't had it before. Her father had understood that. He'd built his whole life around that understanding without ever naming it as a philosophy. She didn't name it either. She just kept doing it. By 9 o'clock, the shop had its working rhythm tools, the occasional percussion of metal on metal, the diagnostic equipment translating problems into language, Walt's murmur beneath the F-150. Claire was at her desk working through foundation paperwork, which accumulated the way weather accumulated, always more arriving before you'd finished with what was already there. The phone rang. Monica Aldred, the foundation's program coordinator in Colorado Springs. Monica was 44, organized to a degree that Claire had initially found slightly alarming and now found deeply reassuring. And she had been doing social services coordination in Colorado for 15 years before Claire hired her in August. "Morning," Monica said. "I have a situation." "Tell me," young woman, mid-20s, living out of her car somewhere south of Fountain. She called the community line this morning. Monica paused in the way she paused when she was selecting words carefully. She sounds like someone who has been holding on for a while and is getting close to the end of what holding on feels like. Claire knew what that felt like. She knew it precisely. In the specific language of the body, the particular quality of exhaustion that wasn't tiredness. The way hope went thin and threadbare until you could almost see through it. The sounds a parking lot made after midnight when the ordinary hum of the world faded and the silence underneath came through. "Where exactly?" she said. Monica gave her the location. A shopping center off a state highway south of Colorado Springs. The woman had said she'd been parking behind a grocery store on the east side. "Tell her 2 hours," Claire said. "Tell her someone's coming and to stay where she is." She went out to the shop floor. Walt. He rolled out from under the F-150. Looked at her with the alert attention of someone whose internal alarm system was well calibrated. "I need to take a few hours. The F-150 is yours. Chris has the Subaru. Brake job scheduled for 11, Mrs. Carruthers. She comes in early. She always does. It's in the book." "I've got it," he said. Not reassurance. Accuracy. She'd learned the difference. She drove south on 115, the mountains doing their October work on her right. The sky a hard clear blue that this elevation produced in autumn like a deliberate effect. 40 minutes, maybe 45. She thought about what Monica had said. Someone who has been holding on and is getting close to the end of what holding on feels like. She'd been there. She knew the geography of it. The way you maintained a performance of okay for the people you encountered, the gas station attendant, the woman at the grocery counter, the security guard who made you move your car to a different part of the lot, because showing how bad it actually was sometimes made people move away rather than toward. You learned to calibrate, to give people the version they could handle, to keep the real version somewhere private, where it couldn't be used against you. The hard thing about that habit was that it didn't stop when the circumstances stopped requiring it. It just kept running, a machine that had been built for survival, and didn't know how to recognize when survival was no longer the immediate project. She'd been working on that, noticing when she was doing it, choosing sometimes not to, imperfectly, but working. The shopping center was the kind that had seen better decades, half the storefronts dark, the parking lot fractured in long runs where the freeze-thaw cycle had done its patient annual work. The grocery store at the east end was still open, lit from inside with the flat brightness of fluorescence. She pulled around to the service alley. A car was parked against the back wall. Mid-2000s sedan, the make identifiable to her before she consciously processed it, mechanic's habit, the automatic catalog of body types. High miles evident in the way it sat, the small accumulation of small dents and paint oxidation. A sunshade in the windshield even though the sun wasn't hitting that angle. Clothes visible through the rear window, folded in the concentrated way of someone who has organized a small space as efficiently as possible, because the alternative is chaos, and chaos is one more thing to manage. She parked at a distance that wasn't looming, got out slowly, walked toward the car at the pace of someone with nowhere she had to be. The window came down about 2 inches. Eyes looked at her through the gap. Late 20s. Fair hair that needed washing but had been pulled back with care. The eyes the color of something that had been bright once and was working to stay that way. A dog's nose appeared below the eyes, medium-sized, some kind of mix, assessing her with the frank professional interest of an animal that had learned to read situations quickly. "Are you from the foundation?" the woman said. "I'm Claire Whitmore, I started it." A pause. Not suspicion, recalibration. "You came yourself, I came myself." She didn't explain further. She'd learned, in the months since they'd started the housing program, that explaining too much too early put people in the position of feeling like a case being managed rather than a person being spoken to. She didn't want this woman to feel like a case. "What's his name?" Claire said, meaning the dog. "Biscuit. A beat." "It's a ridiculous name." "It's a good name," Claire said. "Honest." Biscuit regarded her with ears slightly forward, assessing, making his own determinations. The woman's name was Gail, 28, from a small town near Alamosa originally. She'd worked office management for 4 years and lost the position when the company consolidated its regional offices into a single location 3 states away and didn't offer relocation to anyone below a certain level. The apartment had lasted 5 months on severance and savings. The car had become the backup plan and then the only plan. She told it without drama. The flat, practiced delivery of someone who had told it before, or rehearsed it, or simply processed it so many times that the emotional charge had worn smooth. But underneath that smoothness, Claire could hear what Monica had heard on the phone, the sound of someone who was very, very tired of being strong about this. Claire listened without interrupting. She didn't nod with performed encouragement. She didn't interject with solutions. She just listened, the way she'd learned that people needed to be listened to when they were saying the thing that had been waiting to be said. When Gail stopped, Claire let the silence sit for a moment. Then, I have an apartment available in Colorado Springs. Rent covered for a year, through the foundation. No credit check, no background requirement. Biscuit is welcome. Gail looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has stopped expecting good things and doesn't quite know how to process the arrival of one. What's the catch? She said. No catch. There's always isn't, Claire said. Not harshly, just directly. I know what this is because I've been in it. Not the same circumstances, but the same math and the same feeling about the math. I'm not going to ask you to prove you deserve a door that locks. Something shifted in Gail's face. Not the immediate relief Claire had seen sometimes, the sudden breakdown of a guard held too long. Something quieter and more careful, the very early tentative beginning of believing that this might be real. Okay, Gail said. They spent 30 minutes on logistics. Monica on the phone coordinating paperwork. A unit on the second floor of the Garfield Street building that had been ready for 3 weeks. Gerald, the building super, meeting them there. Claire followed Gail's sedan back north on the highway, watching it in her rearview mirror, the car holding its lane with the slightly effortful stability of a vehicle, being asked to do a little more than it comfortably could. Biscuit's head visible in the passenger window, ears moving in the wind. She thought about the drive she'd made 9 months ago. The county roads getting narrower, the trees closing in, the clearing, the concrete entrance, the door that didn't open on the first try or the second or the third. The thing about the fourth try was that you didn't know, standing there on the first one, that you were going to get there. You just kept going because stopping meant the answer was no, and the answer being no was not something you were ready to accept. She hadn't been. Gail apparently hadn't been either. 3 tries or 30, however many tries it had taken to call the number on the Foundation's community outreach card, she'd made the call. That was the thing that mattered. You couldn't help someone who didn't make the call. The apartment on the second floor of the Garfield Street building had high ceilings from its previous life as a furniture warehouse, and industrial windows that let in light at an angle that changed throughout the day, and a kitchen with enough counter space to actually use. Gerald showed Gail through it without ceremony, which was the right approach, not a sales presentation, just a person opening doors and letting a space speak for itself. Biscuit walked the perimeter of each room with the thoroughness of a professional, sniffed the corners, made his determinations, then sat in the middle of the living room floor and looked at Gail. Gail looked at the apartment. She didn't say anything for a while, and Claire stood near the door and let the silence do what it needed to do, because she knew what was happening in that silence. She'd stood in a generator room in a mountain and felt something similar, the specific recalibration of a person realizing that the thing they'd been working toward had actually arrived. Then Gail said, "Okay." Same word as in the parking lot, different weight entirely. Claire drove back to Crisfield in the early afternoon, the mountains going pink on her left as the sun crossed west, the aspens mostly bare now along the road, the yellow gone to the ground in drifts the wind moved. She stopped at Pierce's on the way through, because she needed coffee, and because Donna was there, as she almost always was, managing the small economy of a rural grocery store with the attention it deserved. Donna looked up when Claire came in, with the particular attentiveness she'd always had, the look of a woman who was paying attention and had decided long ago not to pretend otherwise. Claire poured herself coffee from the station by the door, left $3 in the jar. "How was the call?" Donna said. "Good." She leaned against the counter. "She's in the apartment. She has a dog named Biscuit." Donna's mouth moved. "That's a good name, that's what I said." They stood in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who didn't need to fill space with noise. Outside, through the window, Main Street was doing its October thing, a few trucks. The hardware store owner sweeping his sidewalk with the methodical patience of a man who had been sweeping it for 30 years, and intended to sweep it 30 more. The bare aspens along the median catching the afternoon light in the specific way of trees that have recently let something go. "Raymond called this morning," Donna said. Raymond Greer. Claire had visited him twice since the first week of October. The second visit alone. had been better than the first less weight of occasion. More just two people drinking coffee in a kitchen. He said he wanted to see the garage, Donna continued. See what you've done with it. Tell him Saturday, Claire said. I'll be there all morning. Donna wrote it on the notepad she kept beside the register. The notepad that had Gerald Pitt's number on it somewhere, and Daniel Rourke's schedule, and probably 24 other things that Donna held for people, because she was the kind of person things got held by. Donna, Claire said. When you were holding that envelope for Raymond 5 years, did you know what it was? Donna was quiet for a moment. Not evasion. The pause of someone finding the accurate answer rather than the easy one. Not the specifics, she said. Raymond didn't say specifics. He just said if anyone came asking about the Hale property, give it to them. She straightened a row of soup cans that didn't need straightening. But Walter came through here every month for 20 years. Sat at that table. Paid for whoever was behind him in line. Never said a word about himself. She glanced at Claire. A man who does that for 20 years is thinking about something. Working towards something. You just waited. I waited. She looked at the soup cans. 5 years felt long while I was in it. Looking back, it feels like weather. It passed. Claire finished her coffee. Set the mug down. Thank you, she said. For the 5 years. Donna looked at her directly. Thank Raymond. He's the one who drove up that mountain, after Walter died, to make sure the generator had enough fuel for whoever came next. Claire drove back to the house. Raymond came on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later, on a day that had decided to be almost warm, which was November's occasional gift to the mountains before it stopped offering gifts entirely. He drove himself in his 12-year-old truck, well maintained, she noted automatically, because she couldn't not note it, and parked in front of the garage and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. She watched him through the window. 79 years old and moving at the pace of a man who had made a considered arrangement with his body. He came inside and stood in the doorway and looked at the space the way people look at spaces that tell them something about the person who built them. He looked at the white walls, the pegboards, the tools hung in their sequence, the photographs Thunderbird, Mustang, Camaro. He looked at Walt, who was at the back station with his working murmur going. At Chris, who was explaining something about brake calipers to June, the newest apprentice, with the patient specificity of someone teaching, because they'd recently learned and the material was still fresh and real. Then he looked at Claire. You did good, he said. 3 words. Delivered in the register of a man who didn't use more than the situation required. Come in, she said. He walked the floor slowly. Stopped at the pegboard. She could see him reading the organization of it, the way the tools were grouped, not by category but by the sequence of their use in common repair jobs. The logic of a working space, designed by someone who understood what working actually required. Your father teach you that, he said. Yes. He nodded once. Moved on. They had coffee at the work table in the back, sitting on stools, while the shop continued its work around them. Walt had acknowledged Raymond's presence with a single nod when they passed his station. The nod of someone who understood that something was happening that didn't require his participation. Raymond held his mug with both hands. She looked at those hands, calloused at the base of the fingers, a small scar across the left palm. The hands of someone who had spent decades maintaining things, machines, systems, promises made to a dying friend. She thought about Daniel saying he taught me how to fix the car, and suddenly the whole shape of it was clear. Raymond had kept the generator running for whoever came next, and he had sent the person who would defend her to law school. 2 preparations, 1 man. Neither of them knowing they would connect in exactly this way. She didn't say any of that. Some things were better left as the understanding they already were. He used to talk about what kind of person might find it, Raymond said. Not preamble. Just starting in the middle the way old people sometimes did when the middle was where the important part was. Walter. Not obsessively. But when we'd be checking systems and it would get quiet, he'd say things. About who he imagined coming. What kind of things? Raymond looked at the mug. He said they'd have to know how things worked. Because the generator needed someone who could read it. He said they'd have to be patient. Because the journal took time, he said. He paused. He said they couldn't be the kind of person who quit when something didn't open on the first try. She was very still. He knew about the lock. Raymond said. He'd adjusted the mechanism himself in the last year. Made it so the key needed exactly the right angle on the fourth insertion. Not the first, not the second, the fourth. He looked up. He told me he thought of it as a test. If a person gave up on the third try, they weren't who he was looking for. She thought about standing in the snow, the cold working through her jacket, fingers she could barely feel, the key going in and not turning, and going in again, and then the fourth time the click. She had not thought of it as a test. She had thought of it as a stuck lock, but she had not stopped on the third try. He thought of everything, she said. Raymond considered this. He thought of the logistics, he said, the mechanism, the journal, the code, the shell corporations, the auction placement, the whole structure of it. He set down his mug, but he didn't think about what it would feel like for the person who found it. He thought about the delivery. He didn't think about the weight of receiving. She didn't say anything. Was it heavy? Raymond said. Not a rhetorical question. He actually wanted to know. She thought about the night she'd come up from the vault and lain on the bunk mattress and not slept until 4 a.m. About sitting in Walter's chair with the ledger on the desk and feeling not rich but accountable. About the specific texture of a problem with no diagnostic code to read, no sequence of steps that led reliably to a solution. Yes, she said. It was heavy. Raymond nodded slowly. The nod of someone receiving confirmation of something they'd suspected. He would have wanted to know that, Raymond said. He spent a lot of time thinking about whether he was doing the right thing, whether it would help someone or just overwhelm them. He looked at the wall. I think he knew he couldn't resolve that from where he was sitting. So he built what he could build and trusted the rest. He told you that? He didn't have to. I checked those systems every month for 22 years. I watched what he built become what it became. Raymond picked up his mug again. A man's intentions are in how he maintains his work, what he keeps running when nobody's watching. She thought about the entry in the maintenance log. August 22, 2018. 13 days after Walter died. The single letter R, written quickly. Systems verified. Generator stable. Left as instructed. Why did you go back? She said. After he died. You didn't have to. Raymond was quiet for a moment. He asked me to, he said. Before he died, he asked me to go back one more time after. Make sure the generator had fuel. Make sure the filter was clean. Make sure whoever came next would find it running. He looked at his hands. He said he didn't know when someone would come. Could be a month, could be 10 years. But he wanted the lights to come on when they opened the door. She thought about the moment the generator had caught and the lights in the hallway had come on. The way the darkness had opened up ahead of her. The feeling of a space that had been waiting, deliberately, with the lights ready. She hadn't known that the lights being ready was a choice someone had made, a promise someone had kept. Thank you, she said. For going back, Raymond looked at her over his mug. The look of someone who has heard thank you before in various forms and is deciding whether this particular instance requires a response. He was my friend for 22 years, Raymond said. Going back once was the least of it. She walked him out when he was ready. The morning had held its warmth, the kind of November day that felt like a small apology for what was coming. He stopped at his truck door. Come for dinner sometime, he said. Daniel comes on Thursdays, nothing complicated. Just enough. Thursdays, she said. Don't wait for the right occasion. He opened the truck door. There aren't enough of them. She watched him drive out through town until his truck turned at the hardware store and was gone. Then she went back inside. December arrived without ceremony, which was the only way it ever arrived in the mountains. The first serious snow came on a Wednesday night, 6 inches by morning, and Crisfield woke to the quiet that snow made, the particular muffling of a town that has been revised overnight into something gentler and more demanding simultaneously. The community dinner was held on the Saturday before Christmas. The Hale Foundation's activity room on the ground floor of the Garfield Street building was a space that had been designed, when Claire renovated it, with exactly this kind of use in mind: long tables, folding chairs, a kitchen pass-through that allowed food to move efficiently from preparation to serving. Not elegant, functional, in the way that functional could be its own form of respect for the people using the space. She got there at 6 in the morning with Monica and Gerald and 2 volunteers from the community college program. By 11, the food had started arriving. People had been asked to bring something if they were able, and the ratio of those who brought something to those who didn't reflected, fairly accurately, the distribution of ability in a group of people who were at various stages of getting back on their feet. Walt arrived at noon with a covered dish. She looked at the dish and then at him. "Beef stew," he said, slightly defensive, as if she might argue with this. "You cook, my grandmother." A pause. She had opinions about stew. She sounds like she was right. He relaxed in the small particular way he relaxed when something landed correctly. His son came with him. Danny, 19, with Walt's eyes and a wariness that was either age or something that had been taught, or both. He stood slightly behind his father, in the way of someone who hadn't fully decided yet whether this was a safe room. Claire had heard about Danny in October. In the brief way, Walt mentioned things that mattered, that Danny was living with him now, that things were better, that better was not fixed but it was real. Danny ended up across the room within an hour, helping Chris arrange chairs with the purposeful energy of a young person who had been given a task and was glad to have something to do with their hands. She noticed that, filed it. Gail came at 2 o'clock with Biscuit on a leash. 6 weeks in the apartment, and she was beginning to look like a person who was sleeping again. The specific difference between a face that is carrying everything it owns and a face that has somewhere to set things down. Biscuit assessed the room from the doorway with his professional expression, then apparently cleared it, because he walked in with his tail at a reasonable angle and began making rounds. Preston was already there when Gail arrived. He'd come early 8 o'clock, helped move tables, hadn't made anything of it. He was working a corner of the room now, sitting across from a man Claire recognized as a recent foundation referral, listening with the specific posture of someone who had learned that what was being said was actually important, and not just the prelude to what he was going to say. She watched him for a moment. She'd expected the transition to be harder. Had expected, somewhere in the back of her mind, the performance, the visible effort of a man making amends, the slightly too much of someone who needed to be seen doing the right thing. Preston wasn't doing that. He was just working, listening, following up, coordinating with Monica on case notes, learning the Foundation's database software, badly but persistently. He hadn't mentioned the lawsuit since the day he came to the garage in October. She hadn't either. It was behind them in the way that things could be behind you, when you both understood that the thing in front of you was more worth looking at. Donna arrived at 3 with Raymond, which Claire hadn't known to expect and was glad of. They sat together in the corner by the window, the way people sit who have known each other long enough to not need to do anything specific with the time. Raymond had a plate of food that Gerald had brought him. Donna had coffee. They talked in the low, unhurried register of people for whom conversation had long since stopped being a performance. Daniel came at 4, straight from a client meeting, still in his court clothes, and went immediately to the food table with the focused purpose of a man who had not eaten since morning. He ended up at Raymond's table within 15 minutes, and the three of them, Raymond, Donna, Daniel, settled into something that looked like exactly what it was. People who had been in a story together, sitting in the same room, not needing to explain themselves to each other. Claire moved through the room without staying anywhere too long. She checked in with Monica. She talked to the woman from 2B, whose name was Sheila, and who was 3 months into a bookkeeping course at the community college, and who had that particular brightness of someone who has found something they're good at, and is still slightly surprised by it. She said hello to June, who had come with her husband, a quiet man, who shook Claire's hand and said she'd change things for them, and then looked at the floor because he'd apparently decided that was more than he'd meant to say. She didn't correct him. He wasn't wrong. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, without planning to, she ended up standing at the back of the room looking at all of it. Walt and Danny and Chris at a table near the windows, eating Walt's stew, talking about something that had Danny laughing a real laugh. Not the careful managed version, but the involuntary kind that came from somewhere before the defensive layer. Walt was not quite laughing, but the corner of his mouth was doing something that on another face would have been a grin. Preston in his corner, still listening, having apparently abandoned any agenda beyond the conversation in front of him. Gail near the food table, talking to a woman from the community college program. both of them with the ease of people who have discovered an unexpected common ground. Raymond and Donna and Daniel, three people who had known Walter Hale from different angles, sitting together in a room that existed because of what Walter had built and what Claire had done with it. Biscuit making a dignified circuit of the room. She stood at the back and looked at it. Not the money, not the vault or the ledger or the outcome of the legal hearing. This room. These people who hadn't known each other a year ago, who had come to the same place through different kinds of difficulty and were now in a space together that hadn't existed before Claire had made a decision at 2 in the morning with 3% battery and nowhere to sleep. She thought about Walter in his vault, the chair at the center of all that accumulated wealth, the letter he'd written to a person he'd never meet, asking them to do something he hadn't known how to do himself. She thought about Raymond in the maintenance log. August 22, 2018. Making sure the lights would come on. She thought about a stuck lock in a snowfield. The key going in and not turning, and not turning and not turning, and then turning. The room moved around her. Voices and the sound of chairs and someone laughing in the kitchen about something she couldn't hear, and she stood at the back of it and understood, in a way that didn't require words, what Walter had been trying to say in his letter. He hadn't been asking her to give the money away. He'd been asking her to use it to make rooms like this one. Rooms where people who had been outside of things could come inside. Where the person who had been written off could find out they hadn't been, not by the right person, not by someone paying attention. Where a man could sit with his son and laugh at something real. Where a dog named Biscuit could make his professional rounds and give his approval. The wealth was how you built the room. But the room was the point. The room kept moving around her. She let it. Later, when the tables were being folded and the last of Walt's stew was gone, and Biscuit had finished his final circuit and settled near the door, she drove home through Crisfield in the dark. The streets were quiet. The hardware store was closed. The aspens along the median were bare and still. She went to sleep without writing anything down. Some things didn't need a list. The next morning came the way mornings came, when the day ahead had work in it, not with urgency, but with a kind of readiness that was its own form of anticipation. She was at the garage by 6:45. The 1967 Mustang had been on the lift for 3 weeks. A restoration job that belonged to a woman in town named Audrey, whose husband had kept the car in their garage for 20 years before he died, and who had finally decided she wanted to drive it rather than preserve it. The carburetor had needed a complete rebuild. Claire was finishing the reassembly now, each part finding its place in the sequence, the logic of the component restoring itself under her hands. Walt came in at 7 with 2 cups of coffee, set one near her elbow without interrupting what she was doing. "How's it going?" "Almost there." She fitted a gasket into place, felt it seat correctly. Another hour. He leaned against the bench and drank his coffee. New referral from the Veterans Organization. Coming in Thursday for intake. "Who's running the intake?" June said she would. She looked up at that. She asked. Walt said, "Yesterday afternoon." Said she thought she was ready. Claire looked back at the carburetor. June had been with them 7 weeks. She had the instincts for the mechanical work, and she had, more importantly, the instinct for the thing underneath the mechanical work. The way to be with someone who was coming in with difficulty they were trying not to show. "She's ready," Claire said. Walt drank his coffee. Outside, the sound of Chris arriving, his car pulling into the lot, the particular rhythm of his door closing. She'd learned the sound of each of them. The way you learned over time, the sounds of the people who shared a space with you. "You know," Walt said, "you could hire someone to handle the dirty work." She looked at her hands. The oil worked into the creases of her knuckles, the stain along the cuticles that soap and a nail brush addressed, but never fully resolved. Calluses on the inside of the thumb, and first 2 fingers from 9 years of gripping tools. The scar across the right palm from a box cutter, 6 years ago, that had healed slightly crooked. Her father's hands had looked like this. She'd watched them her whole childhood, reaching into engines, coming away dark, wiping clean enough to eat dinner. Never completely clean. "I know," she said, and went back to the carburetor. Walt finished his coffee, set the mug on the bench, went to his station and picked up where he'd left off the day before. June arrived at 7:20. Chris at 7:15. The shop found its rhythm. At 9:07 the phone rang. Monica. Morning brief, the same time every day. A ritual that had become load-bearing in the structure of how Claire understood what the foundation was doing and where it was needed. 2 things, Monica said. Go. Community college partnership wants to expand. Second track administrative and office skills, not just trades. They think we can double enrollment by spring. Set a meeting. Next week. Already on the calendar. Monica's pause, not the organizational one, the other kind. Second thing. I have a call. Woman in a car south of Pueblo. She's been out there a few weeks. She called the line this morning. Claire set down the wrench she'd picked up. She sounds like she's getting close to the end of what she has left, Monica said. And she has a cat, which she mentioned twice. I think the cat matters. Claire thought about Biscuit making his rounds at the community dinner. The professional expression. The considered approval. The cat mattered. Tell her 2 hours, she said. Tell her I'm coming. She changed out of her shop apron. Walt was watching her from across the floor, with the situational awareness of someone who had learned to read the shift in her attention. That meant something had come up. The Mustang, she started. I've got it. Simple. Certain. The voice of a man who knew what he was capable of. She picked up her keys. Outside, the morning was the cold, clear kind that the mountains made in December. The sky an intense blue, the snow on the peaks, sharp and white in the early light. She got in the Toyota and sat for a moment before starting it. She thought about the drive she'd made 9 months ago. Up into the mountains instead of down, through trees instead of through plains, towards something she had no certainty about, except that it was shelter, and she needed shelter badly enough to spend $750 she couldn't afford on something she'd never seen. She thought about the key going in on the 4th try. She thought about Raymond, 79 years old, driving up a mountain 13 days after his friend died to make sure there was enough fuel in the generator for whoever came next. She thought about what it meant to be the whoever who came next. And then she stopped thinking and started the truck and pulled out onto Main Street and drove south through Crisfield, past Pierce's where Donna was already inside doing whatever Donna was always doing, past the hardware store, past the spot where the aspens had been yellow 3 weeks ago and were bare now, past the town limit sign and onto the highway, with the mountains going by on the left, and the plains opening up on the right, and the road stretching south towards someone who had been holding on and needed to find out that holding on had been worth it. The cat mattered. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the mountains were white against blue sky. The road south was straight and clear and long. She started the engine.